Melissa Kalyasinski was the youngest of 5 siblings in the Kalyasinski family. They were always friendly and were considered an exemplary family living near Chicago, Illinois, USA. Melissa was very friendly and compassionate. However, according to her sister Crystal, Melissa faced social difficulties during her childhood. She had trouble making friends at school and was often teased. Melissa suffered from this, but she remained friendly throughout her life. When Melissa grew up and graduated from school, she decided to dedicate her life to working with children. At 22 years old, immediately after receiving her certificate, she began looking for a job in her favorite field. She was interested in kindergartens, working as a nanny, and caring for the younger generation. Naturally, she always wanted to have children, so she waited for the right partner with whom she could start a family. Finally, luck smiled upon her professionally. Melissa became an assistant teacher at Manise Sobe Kindergarten located in Lincolnshire, a small, cozy suburb of Chicago. Melissa's eldest sister, Crystal, worked there and helped arrange for her position. Under Melissa's supervision were several small children, particularly Benjamin Kingen. It seemed everything was going well. She was happy to find fulfillment in her work with children, at least until January 14, 2009. That day, Melissa worked her usual shift as an assistant teacher. Benjamin appeared calm and played with the other children. At around 3:15 p.m., after the children were fed and the table cleared, Melissa placed Benjamin on the children's rug. He climbed into the rocking chair, played with a blanket, and began to fall asleep, just as he did after lunch. The teacher briefly stepped out, leaving Melissa alone with the children. Melissa became distracted by the other kids and later noticed something was wrong with Benjamin. The 16-month-old boy had orange foam coming out of nose. Crystal, who was with another group, quickly rushed to Melissa's screams and attempted to resuscitate the boy while calling 911. While they waited for help, Crystal made several attempts to revive the child. It was strange that Benjamin had no visible injuries, no open wounds, and no blood that could have caused his loss of consciousness. Melissa did not understand what could have happened. Benjamin was still alive when the ambulance arrived, and he was taken to the hospital as an emergency. Doctors fought for an hour to save his life, but at 4:50 p.m., Benjamin Kingen was declared dead. Initially, it was completely unclear what had happened to Benjamin. After the autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head inflicted several hours before the 911 call. Despite this, there were no external signs of injury, which seemed strange. Moreover, a skull fracture was found, causing extensive bleeding in the brain. The only way to help Benjamin was to act quickly, but according to the medical examiner, too much time had passed. Naturally, Melissa immediately came under suspicion since she was the last adult with whom Benjamin had interacted and was responsible for caring for the child in the teacher's absence. A few days into the investigation, Melissa was called in for questioning at the police station and quickly became the main suspect in the case. From the very beginning, she denied any involvement and claimed that she had no idea what had happened. However, the detectives were serious and considered her guilty of murder. The interrogations lasted 9 hours. Exhausted, Melissa eventually admitted that she had thrown Benjamin on the floor, claiming he probably died from a blow to the head. She was asked to demonstrate how it happened and threw a toy doll on the floor in front of them. According to the investigators, this reconstruction of events was convincing enough to justify her arrest and the charge of first-degree murder. However, on the same day, Melissa retracted her confession, asserting that she was innocent and had been a victim of police coercion. She insisted that her confession was made under pressure, and she denied, dozens of times, that she had harmed the child. According to her, she was held for long hours and constantly pressured. She believed that the only way to get out of the interrogation room was to confess to the murder. In total, Melissa spent about 14 hours in police custody, and her confession came after 9 hours of continuous pressure. She was even transferred to another department to reaffirm her statement and repeated her confession to another investigator on videotape. When the parents found out that Melissa was considered a murderer, they exclaimed that this must be some kind of mistake. The girl was always kind and very sweet, especially when it came to treating children. The family was sure that she was not guilty, but it became obvious that Melissa was in a very difficult situation. To defend Melissa's interests at the trial, the family even sold most of their property to hire the best lawyer. In November 2011, Melissa appeared in court. The prosecutor's case relied heavily on a video recording in which Melissa confessed to the crime. In her confession, she claimed that the children in the kindergarten were very restless that day, and that she had forcibly thrown Benjamin to the floor, which is probably how he hit his head. Melissa's defender, Paul DeLuca, insisted that the confession was coerced during interrogation and made under pressure from detectives who simply wanted to close the case as quickly as possible. The medical examiner had assessed the situation incorrectly from the start, deciding it was murder. Paul insisted that Benjamin had a recent head injury elsewhere. X-rays of Benjamin were used as evidence to support this theory, but the images provided by the prosecutor were too blurry to be relied upon. In the opinion of the forensic expert who performed the autopsy on Benjamin, they found a fracture in Benjamin that caused extensive internal bleeding. The specialist was certain that the injury was inflicted on the boy by a stranger using great force. The investigators had no doubt that a few hours before his death, Melissa had a fit of anger and used physical force against him. However, the autopsy report stated that there were absolutely no external injuries. There were no cuts, abrasions, or bruises on Benjamin's head or other parts of his body. Was it possible to break his skull in such a way that it would not be visible? The lawyer doubted it. When Melissa was brought in for questioning, she denied the police's suspicions more than 60 times. The conversation with her lasted for 9 long hours, during which she was never provided with a lawyer. According to her defense attorney, detectives put pressure on her during this time, forcing her to make a false confession, as they were mentally and physically exhausting her during the hearings in Lake County, Illinois. Prosecutors claimed that Benjamin was perfectly healthy. According to the expert, he personally examined the boy's body and felt the site of Benjamin's skull fracture with his own hands. Melissa's defense attorney assessed the chances of winning the case as very small from the very beginning. He believed that it would be easiest to try to get a mitigated sentence. It was difficult to refute the argument regarding the child's skull fracture, especially since the court referred to the medical experts whose opinions were considered authoritative. The lawyer found a single point that he managed to cling to. Shortly before the start of the hearing, the prosecutor handed him a disc with X-rays that were too dark and practically illegible. For this reason, the jury considered these arguments insignificant. They all stated that they could not see anything and did not take the pictures into account. Based on the experts' opinions and the recordings of Melissa's confession, on November 30, 2011, the jury retired to deliberate. They spent a little less than 7 hours, after which Melissa Kalyasinski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison. As she left the courtroom, she continued to insist on her innocence. She had a vast number of supporters who considered her a victim of tyranny. Unfortunately, the evidence presented seemed unconvincing to the jury. The more the defense tried to find a way to save the client from prison, the more the prosecution's behavior resembled a conspiracy. 2 old teachers, including Nancy Collinger, made significant statements. She later spoke with the defendant's lawyer and also told investigators that during this period, Benjamin had hit his head. This occurred because of Benjamin's habit of leaning back. The boy fell and hit himself hard. The kindergarten called his mother and reported the incident, prompting her to take Benjamin to the doctor. However, after the examination, the expert stated that he did not see any problems or serious injuries. The pediatrician recommended that the relatives take better care of the child and simply sent him home, insisting that there were no consequences. Why the doctor did not notice anything became unclear. It is curious that the police did not refer to Nancy at all during the trial, or may have deliberately concealed these facts. Several kindergarten employees stated that for several days after this injury, Benjamin had been behaving sluggishly. He often displayed symptoms of a traumatic brain injury just 2 days before his death. He also exhibited alarming symptoms. The second teacher who worked with Melissa noticed that something was wrong with Benjamin. He vomited for no apparent reason, and a similar situation occurred again the next day. On the 3rd day, Benjamin died. When comparing the witness accounts, there is a convincing explanation for what happened to him. He had already sustained an injury that other kindergarten workers noticed 3 months before his death. However, Melissa had only worked there for a short time and did not have the opportunity to learn about this incident. She simply did not have time to learn his habits. According to the lawyer, Benjamin's condition gradually worsened because of an old craniocerebral injury. On the day he died, he likely leaned back again, resulting in a fatal blow that caused a hemorrhage. Unfortunately, none of these arguments had any effect. Melissa was determined to prove her innocence. The first progress in this case was made just a year after the prison sentence began in 2012. During this period, Lake County had a new chief medical examiner, Thomas Rudd. The lawyer met with him repeatedly, insisting that the case should be examined more closely. The expert became interested, took up the case, and carefully reviewed the images of Benjamin's brain. He found an image that was evidence of an old injury that the previous autopsy had missed. Thomas, along with another forensic expert who was also interested in the case, agreed. The experts had no doubt that the old injury could have been aggravated. Benjamin had likely caused this himself several days before his death. On that fateful day, several teachers still stated that Benjamin often leaned back and hit his head. Daycare worker Nancy was again interviewed. She was in the kindergarten on the day Benjamin died. According to her, she personally saw he fall backwards twice that day. The first backward was not very strong, it was softened by the furniture. However, the second time he fell, he hit his head quite hard. The doctor openly stated that the boy's old injury was indeed extensive and very dangerous due to its severity. Benjamin should have been under constant careful supervision, and no injuries to the head should have been allowed. Continuous supervision should have been ensured. The parents should have understood this. It would have been logical to take him out of kindergarten for a while and care for him more closely due to several strong blows to the head, which the child could not control. Fluid formed that pressed on the brain, which caused the respiratory system to fail. This was what ultimately led to his death. According to the doctor, it is worth noting that this convinced even Dr. Yupil Choi, who performed the initial autopsy. He reviewed the images of Benjamin's brain and agreed that he had missed evidence of trauma during the autopsy. However, he refused to change his initial report. At the trial, Choi signed a new report but deleted certain words, significantly downplaying the severity of the blow he initially reported. In 2015, another breakthrough occurred in this case, which seemed very promising. The doctor's staff found post-mortem images of Benjamin's brain and skull in the old medical examiner's office, which were much clearer than those shown to the defense attorney in 2011. It is now clear that Benjamin did not have a skull fracture at the time of his death. It is obvious that the boy was not beaten, he only had an old injury. This allowed the new medical examiner to change the cause of death on Benjamin's certificate from murder to undetermined. In addition, Kathleen Zellner, a lawyer who became interested in the case of Melissa Kalyasinski, took it up. She had built a career freeing wrongfully convicted people from prison and was always in search of justice. However, it was not easy. First, she needed to achieve a retrial of the case. At the end of 2016, her persistence paid off. The new defense attorney was given the opportunity to present evidence. Great hopes were placed on the X-rays, which showed no traces of a skull fracture. This radically changed the situation and became the irrefutable medical evidence refuting the claim of harm inflicted on Benjamin by Melissa. Kathleen insisted that, had the obscure darkened images revealing the true picture of what happened been shown at the first trial, the jury's decision would likely have been different. The doctor agreed that the argument regarding the supposed skull fracture was indeed very weighty at the initial hearing. Although this assertion was not true, the prosecution had referred to it at least 32 times, making it appear decisive. The prosecution tried to counter these assertions by claiming that the previous lawyer had the necessary software to lighten and enhance the images, but he simply did not do so. The defense denied that he actually had such programs, and furthermore, lightening the images could be regarded as falsifying evidence. During this stage of the hearing, another specialist, Manny Montez, spoke. In light of the reliable pictures discovered, questions arose. How could he have felt a non-existent fracture during the examination if it was not there? This seemed absurd, as his words were contradicted by another expert who stated that the assistant had never physically touched Benjamin or visually examined him. Nevertheless, both experts for the prosecution continued to insist on their conclusions. After the hearing, both doctors refused any comments on the case requested by journalists. After discussing all these inconsistencies, the judge made a decision and denied Melissa a retrial. He sided with the prosecution, arguing that Melissa's lawyer could have made the pictures clearer at the first trial, which was solely his responsibility. Melissa left the courtroom in tears, telling her lawyer that she simply did not understand why she should spend a decade in prison for something she did not do. For almost 10 years, her defense team filed appeal after appeal, all of which were finally rejected. In April 2018, their voice was heard. In the lawyer's opinion, the client was convicted based on false evidence. However, this again did not help, as the lack of credible medical evidence was evident. In 2022, a significant new event occurred in Lake County. A new prosecutor emerged who was interested in the case of Melissa Kalyasinski. However, to confirm or refute her guilt, something substantial was needed. The prosecutor recommended contacting a digital forensics company called Garrett Discovery. Two specialists immediately examined the X-rays of Benjamin and concluded that all the images had been altered by someone with malicious intent. Special software was employed to examine the X-ray images, allowing the brightness of the photographs to be reduced and darkened intentionally. At the same time, the images were blurred, making it nearly impossible to discern any details. The organization's experts informed the new prosecutor that they could not even imagine an innocent explanation for what had occurred. He was extremely indignant, insisting that this was essentially a crime of forgery of evidence, and that the perpetrator should be held accountable. The lawyer had high hopes for this meeting, convinced that something could truly be accomplished. To the surprise of the defense team and the Kalyasinski family, nothing happened. By April 2024, the lawyer decided to appeal to the governor for a pardon, requesting Melissa's release due to the lack of new evidence. Given the resistance from the law enforcement system to review the decision, it seemed that this was their only chance for freedom. A new appeal for retrial was filed on May 1, 2024, consisting of 337 pages. Several months passed before the argument was finally heard on July 9. The defense requested Melissa's release through an appeal to the governor of Illinois, citing new evidence from her term. She had served 16 years, and her expected release date was set for December 2042, with the possibility of parole appearing on July 9, 2024. A hearing was scheduled before the governor's board of prisoners. Then an unexpected event occurred. The new prosecutor met with the family of Benjamin and spoke with the parents and their lawyer. It's hard to say what was discussed, but afterward, the prosecutor addressed the governor's board, stating that he strongly opposed Melissa's appeal and had become convinced of her guilt. He argued that there was no new evidence that could convincingly prove her innocence, and he refused to meet with journalists or make any public statements regarding the matter. On July 9 of the same year, the lawyer took a counter-move by appealing to the Prison Supervision Board. Melissa still did not understand why the authorities were resisting so strongly. Several experts in computer forensics joined her cause, and a psychologist examined Melissa. The analysis indicated that she was easily susceptible to pressure, making her prone to giving false testimony. Furthermore, she had resisted the influence of detectives at the station for about 9 hours before breaking down. Various psychiatrists evaluated Melissa, diagnosing her with borderline intellectual functioning. Her comprehension score was only 4.8 points, which is quite low. It was noted that Melissa had a slight mental impairment, which made her an easy target for police pressure. Individuals with borderline intellectual functioning typically have an intelligence level of around 70-80, with retardation beginning below 70. It was also discovered that 2.5 years before Benjamin's death, Melissa had reported an incident of abuse, leading to her diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, from which she suffered when confronted by 2 detectives biased against her case. Under duress, she eventually confessed to a crime she did not commit. It was believed that Melissa's psychological condition warranted a review of the court's decision. However, 2 assistant prosecutors spoke out against it, including one who had participated in the hearing of Melissa case in 2011. Benjamin's parents also expressed their view, categorically opposing any reconsideration of Melissa's case, particularly Benjamin's mother, who insisted that Melissa had struck and killed their son. In their opinion, she deserved to remain in prison for the rest of her life. The medical experts brought in by the defense modified their stance, now arguing that the skull fracture that had been previously misidentified was, in fact, a normal bone suture in the cranial vault, and the expert had simply made a mistake. At 16 months, it was anticipated that after further hearings, the Prison Supervision Commission would provide the governor with a confidential recommendation, which could be decisive in determining whether to release Melissa. During a meeting, the assembled commission asked Melissa what she would say to the governor if given the opportunity. She said she would merely ask him to consider her case, believing that he would quickly see she had done nothing wrong regarding Benjamin Kingan if he reviewed the case materials. The prosecutor maintained that the lawyer should have been the one to edit the photographs. However, experts from the digital forensic lab asserted that he couldn't have altered the images while maintaining their resolution and quality without it being evident as a forgery. Melissa had spent nearly a decade and a half behind bars due to false statements and discredited evidence that could have jeopardized the careers of the individuals responsible. In the lawyer's report, despite the prosecutor's assertions, there was valuable information. Additionally, a specialist in complex confessions who took on Melissa's case spoke with the lawyers, the family, and Melissa herself. They also communicated with 2 employees from the daycare who worked there prior to the hiring of Melissa. This information revealed that Benjamin had a tendency to lean backward and had hit his head quite hard, which was previously unknown, possibly hidden by law enforcement. As of now, the case is under review by the governor, with no set timeframe for a decision. Melissa continues to serve her sentence. Her parents await her return, not believing in her guilt. Her room is still furnished as if she will return home from work at any moment. Hey detectives, welcome back. We've got another mysterious case to explore, the case of Lauren Malt. While at university, Karen met Nigel Malt, a man with ambitious career goals. Their relationship started off well and seemed promising for starting a family. Although Karen's mother was concerned about Nigel's rude behavior, she chose to ignore this advice. They later married and had a daughter, Lauren Malt, who was born on April 8, 2002. Initially, Karen and Nigel's life together appeared happy, and they seemed to have a bright future ahead of them. However, over time, Nigel began to manipulate Karen. He used typical abuser tactics, suppressing her emotions with lies and appealing to her feelings of pity, which made her dependent on him. She was financially dependent on her husband and was unable to continue her studies due to pregnancy, making it difficult for her to find a job later on. Nigel had a long history of addiction to alcohol and prohibited substances. By this time, he was unable to function without these substances, which led to serious consequences for his life and family. Nigel had been a kind person before, but as his addiction worsened, his personality changed dramatically. He became aggressive and cruel toward Karen. Nigel's violent outbursts increased, and he began to take his anger out on Karen, eventually leading to physical abuse. Things worsened when their daughter, Lauren, observed the abuse. Despite this, Karen fought hard to save the relationship. By the time she could no longer take it, they had 4 children together. The thought of divorce was terrifying, especially with a long legal battle ahead. Their joint assets were minimal, and the prospect of being a single mother to 4 children worried Karen. She was particularly stressed about child support and custody, fearing that her husband Nigel might try to gain custody of the children just to hurt her. At this time, everyone was tired of Nigel's irresponsible behavior. He used to earn money and support his family, but now he had started to waste almost all of his income on alcohol and prohibited substances. Karen was very concerned about the impact this had on their children, who were growing up in fear. Their father drank every day and often abused their mother in front of them. This situation could not go on forever, but Karen was patient for a long time. Despite her family and friends urging her to leave him, she stayed for the sake of her children. It became clear that Nigel could not change. Karen decided to talk to Nigel about getting a divorce, which led to another angry outburst from him. He refused to pay alimony, making his stance clear to her. However, she and the children no longer wanted to live with someone so dangerous. The conversation ended in another conflict, filled with threats, which only strengthened Karen's resolve to leave her unfit husband as soon as possible. In March 2021, Karen reported Nigel's violent behavior to the police after a violent fight broke out while he was drunk. Karen later withdrew her testimony to spare him trouble, hoping that he would cooperate and consider a peaceful divorce. However, his failure to take responsibility made the situation worse. In April, Karen experienced an even more severe beating, which left her terrified for her life and concerned for her children. Realizing she needed to take action to end the abuse, she contacted the police again to report the domestic violence. Taking advantage of the moment Nigel was taken to the police station, she decided to escape with her children to her mother's house. However, he posted bail and was released while awaiting further legal action. He was placed under house arrest and tried to manipulate her emotions by claiming he would end his life. But this no longer affected Karen. She was determined to act strongly and see things through to the end. To show Nigel that she was serious, she attempted to obtain a restraining order, but unfortunately, this effort failed. During this time, financial troubles worsened, leading Nigel to drink more heavily and become increasingly aggressive, cruel. He could not control his anger, treating not only his wife poorly, but also Lauren and their sons. Finally, Nigel was found guilty of domestic violence and received a suspended sentence. He was prohibited from contacting Karen and the children. During this time, he lost everything. Karen left him and refused to listen to any excuses or promises. He also lost touch with his children, who were no longer interested in seeing him because of his unpredictable and cruel behavior. Alcohol, which he had developed a daily habit of consuming, was banned, and he was unable to control his addiction. It appeared he was using alcohol as a way to cope with the hope of reconciling with his wife. However, Karen was firm in her decision and demanded a divorce. All of this has left Nigel feeling demotivated. Despite his promises to stop using prohibited substances, his condition worsened. He claimed this was due to his need to cope with his problems. The issue of alimony needed to be addressed, as it was nearly impossible for Karen to support 4 children alone. Karen found a job as a salesperson, but her income was insufficient. To help, their daughter Lauren took on several part-time jobs. Meanwhile, Karen's lawyer reassured her that she didn't need to worry about custody. Nigel was a severe alcoholic, and due to allegations of violence, he could be completely barred from seeing the children. At this time, Lauren's relationship with her father, Nigel, was strained, so she only wanted to communicate with her mother. During this time, Karen and her children lived in her grandmother's house in a small village called West Winch in Norfolk County, UK. Lauren turned 19 during this time and was dating a guy named Arthur. On Sunday, January 23, 2022, Arthur took Lauren to work at the store where she was employed as a salesperson. Throughout the day, Nigel called his daughter, Lauren, multiple times. It was unclear what he wanted, but she suspected he was in an unstable state. To avoid distractions at work, she chose not to engage in any conversations. After a long and tiring shift, Lauren returned home, hoping to unwind with her boyfriend before starting her next shift the following day. She was working hard, including overtime, to save money for her education. That evening, Nigel began calling again. It was clear he was not sober. Lauren decided to ignore his calls, hoping he would calm down. However, he was relentless, calling 19 times between 6:25 p.m. and 6:52 p.m. Despite the constant ringing, Lauren remained silent. Unfortunately, ignoring Nigel was no longer an option. He lived just 10 minutes away, making it easy for him to show up unannounced. At around 7:01 p.m., Nigel called Lauren, and she answered out of fear that not responding would escalate things further. Their conversation was brief and quickly turned hostile, filled with insults and threats. Lauren tried to calm her father, but her efforts only seemed to infuriate him more. According to Arthur, Nigel arrived at Lauren's house at 7:21 p.m. while Karen was at work. He was clearly drunk and acted aggressively. Lauren stepped outside, attempting to de-escalate the situation, but he responded with insults and tried to provoke a fight. He swung the crowbar and nearly hit her several times. After several attempts to grab her, he threatened to attack Arthur, who had been with her. Eventually, Lauren prompted Nigel to leave, expressing her desire to avoid further communication with him in that state. Lauren attempted to get Nigel into the car to make him leave, but unexpectedly he began screaming again. He jumped into his car, and just as Lauren was behind it, he suddenly reversed and ran over his own daughter. He paused for a few seconds, staring at her through the windshield. She was seriously injured, bleeding and screaming for help, but he did nothing. He didn't even get out of the car or call for an ambulance. Instead, he pressed the gas pedal and ran over Lauren a second time. It all happened so fast that Arthur couldn't react in time to assist her. The commotion drew the attention of neighbors, who called the police. One man rushed into the street, trying to stop Nigel, the crazed driver. Nigel saw Lauren lying on the ground, moaning in pain with serious injuries, but she was still alive. The neighbor realized that calling an ambulance was urgent, as Lauren had sustained injuries that would prevent her from being moved. However, Nigel was indifferent and insisted that everything was fine, claiming Lauren only had a few scratches. He pushed away the neighbor and Arthur, who were shouting at him to stop and call for help. Instead of calling emergency services, Nigel picked up Lauren and placed her in the passenger seat of his car. As he did this, Lauren moaned in pain, especially when Nigel tried to push her into the car. She was unable to sit up straight or maintain her balance due to her injuries, which likely included fractures. Nigel didn't even buckle her seatbelt, causing her to roll onto the floor in front of the passenger seat. While driving, he called his ex-wife, Karen, and began to tell a confusing story about an incident in which he accidentally injured Lauren. He was drunk, and his explanation was muddled. Karen didn't fully understand what was happening, but decided to wait for Nigel to arrive at her workplace. Nigel insists that Lauren is not seriously injured, and wants to inform Karen so that Karen can take her to the hospital. He admitted that he couldn't do it himself because he had been drinking and was afraid of losing his driver's license. He drove directly to the parking lot in front of the store where Karen worked. Upon seeing Lauren's condition, Karen realized that Nigel had downplayed the severity of the situation. Lauren was in critical condition, and Karen struggled to lift her from the floor into a seat. During this time, Nigel merely watched in silence. Lauren showed no response. It appeared she could lose consciousness from the pain. Eventually, Karen called for an ambulance. Lauren was taken to the hospital, where doctors quickly realized her injuries were severe and could only be treated at a specialized medical center. They did everything possible to save her life. Unfortunately, a few minutes after she was on the operating table, her heart stopped beating. Meanwhile, the police arrived at the scene where Lauren was stabbed. There, they met Arthur and the neighbors, who witnessed the horrific incident. Bloody tire marks were visible on the driveway, evidence left by Nigel. Unlike many other crimes, there was enough evidence to bring immediate charges. The medical examiner evaluated the injuries of Lauren, who was the victim of a double car crash. She suffered a broken back, which caused her to lose her balance and fall onto the car floor. Her rib cage was severely damaged, Multiple ribs were broken, her lungs were torn, and she experienced significant internal bleeding. The traumatic injuries to her chest and abdomen were fatal, as many of her internal organs were crushed or harmed by bone fragments. It was clear that she had been run over by a car, and she might have survived the first collision. After the second collision, she might have had a chance of survival if she had not been pushed into the car by Nigel and fallen, and if paramedics had been called immediately. Unfortunately, her fall to the floor of the car made her condition worse, and the delay ultimately claimed her life. Nigel Malt was quickly apprehended. It was discovered that he was highly intoxicated, with a blood alcohol level more than twice the legal limit for driving. Karen believed his aggressive behavior was solely due to alcohol or prohibited substance use. After his arrest, Nigel refused to cooperate with authorities. Nigel provided basic details about his name and address to the police, but refused to discuss the incident. During the preliminary hearing, he denied any wrongdoing, despite clear evidence against him. He explained that he went to see Lauren that evening after she didn't answer his calls, and then spoke to him rudely. He tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive because he was leaving and planned to talk later. As he backed his car out, he felt a slight thump, but assumed he had hit a box or a rock that he hadn't seen in the rearview mirror. He had no clue that he had run over his own daughter. When he backed up to check what he had hit, he accidentally ran over her again. This is clearly a dishonest excuse from a coward who dares not admit his guilt. The detectives observed how unemotional he was when discussing his daughter's death, and it seemed to have no effect on him. In conversations about his family, he often spoke of Karen and Lauren with disdain. This situation was completely baffling. Nigel's wife Karen was a good woman devoted to her family. Lauren grew up to be just like her mother, a decent person. Despite the difficult home life caused by Nigel, she avoided alcohol and other harmful substances. Instead, she focused on her education, career, and improving her life. The neighbor and Lauren's boyfriend Arthur contradicted Nigel's assertion that the incident was accidental. They claimed that after Nigel ran over her while reversing, he paused for a few seconds, shining his headlights on her. Nigel could not have missed her at that moment. Then, he intentionally ran over her a second time. This could not have been an accident. Even if he didn't see her the first time, she was clearly in his line of sight the second time. The neighbor claimed that there was a conflict between Nigel and Lauren that evening. He described Nigel as aggressive and unkind. Even when Nigel hit Lauren with his car, he showed anger on his face and did not stop. The neighbor believed that the violence started because Lauren was simply asking him to leave. The police have obtained new evidence. While the neighbor attempted to talk to Nigel, several local residents recorded the incident with their cameras and phones from their windows. This footage was later presented in court. It clearly showed Nigel intentionally running over Lauren, and the prosecutor's office argued that the initial incident was also not an accident. Even the defense lawyer acknowledged that what happened could hardly be seen as a mere coincidence. The defense attorney focused on arguing that the murder was unintentional, but this argument lacked credibility. However, the bloody tire tracks and Nigel's tire tracks were a perfect match. Given the undeniable evidence, Nigel Malt was found guilty. In September 2022, a hearing was held where the sentence was announced. Nigel Malt was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 18 years before he could apply for parole. The court noted that Karen's claims of domestic violence were considered when determining the sentence. Karen's family made it clear that they would remain involved. Karen stated in a media interview that she would attend every parole hearing to ensure that Nigel did not get released. At the sentencing hearing, Nigel relied on crutches for support throughout the proceedings. He maintained his innocence, claiming the incident was an accident. Many believed he was trying to gain sympathy from the court by portraying himself as a victim, a tactic he often used with Karen. Others saw this as just punishment for a man who had killed a child. Karen had decided to proceed with the divorce, feeling ashamed to be associated with a man who killed his own daughter in a drunken rage. He had used his car as a weapon, running over her twice and leaving her no chance of survival. Given these circumstances, Karen felt the sentence was too lenient and believed Nigel should never be released. Karen argued that he was a dangerous and cruel man who had completely lost control due to excessive drinking and the use of prohibited substances. She warned that if he were released, he would continue to kill. It was only a matter of time. Notably, Nigel's sons have repeatedly stated that they would only feel safe if their father remained in prison for life. The case has created great public outrage, leading to much discussion about protecting children and spouses from domestic abusers. Activists are calling for harsher penalties for individuals like Nigel, including life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. However, no substantial changes have been made so far. Hello friends. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Bill Mowbray. Bill Mowbray lived in Brownsville, Texas, USA, in 1987. He was a decent and loving man who was married to Susie. This was his second marriage. From his first marriage, Bill had a daughter named Christine, who lived with her mother. When Susie met Bill, she was also divorced and had brought her 2 children to live with them. Over the past 9 years, they have built a happy family together. They were only 4 years apart in age and shared many things in common. Despite Susie's eccentric personality, Bill thought of her as the ideal wife. Bill was dedicated not only to his family but also to his career. After attending college, he began working in car sales and eventually transformed into a prominent businessman. By 1987, he had successfully managed Mal Motors, a Cadillac dealership in Brownsville, for 13 years. Susie actively supported his work, often visiting the dealership and even appearing in commercials broadcast across the city. Their success brought them considerable wealth, making them local celebrities regularly seen on TV. The family enjoyed traveling and owned a large mansion in Brownsville, 2 beachfront villas, and several luxury cars. On the surface, their life appeared enviable, but in reality, it was far less glamorous. In recent years, Bill's business had struggled, with the dealership stagnating and showing no signs of growth. Bill realized he was sinking deeper into debt because his expenses far exceeded his income. Despite facing financial difficulties, they upheld an image of wealth and continued to spend lavishly. As their money problems worsened, it became evident they were facing a serious financial crisis. By 1987, the situation had also severely impacted Bill's mental health. He began suffering from depression and often voiced that ending his own life might be the only way to escape their predicament. For Susie, this was an extremely difficult time. Her husband had never spoken or behaved this way before, and she feared he might do something drastic. His relatives were equally concerned for his well-being. They arranged consultations with a psychotherapist in the hopes of helping him, but their efforts yielded little progress. Bill remained firm in his belief that their family urgently needed money, otherwise, the business would collapse, leaving them on the verge of poverty. A solution to their financial struggles seemed nowhere in sight. Facing the threat of bankruptcy, Susie and Bill ultimately believed their best hope lay in securing a new loan from the bank. On September 15, 1987, Susie, 39, and Bill, 43, called to wish Susie's son a happy 16th birthday. At the time, her son and daughter were visiting their father. The conversation was warm and enjoyable, and everything seemed normal. Later that evening, Susie and Bill watched a TV show together before heading to bed. In the early hours of the morning, around 2:15 a.m., Susie woke up to the terrifying scene of her husband holding a weapon pointed at his own head. Before she could react, he pulled the trigger, using his right hand while lying on his side. Shocked and terrified, Susie called out to him, but he didn't respond. Blood rapidly soaked the bed, and with mounting horror, she realized the gravity of his injury. Panicked, she rushed to the home phone to seek help but accidentally dialed the number of her work partner, Bill Luke Roy, instead of emergency services. Susie told Luke what had happened and confessed she didn't know what to do. Luke immediately urged her to call 911. She followed the advice and called the emergency services. However, she had already lost precious minutes, which forced the ambulance to set off immediately. When the ambulance crew arrived at the scene, they found Susie outside the house, standing calmly with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. Showing no signs of distress, she led the paramedics inside and gestured toward the bedroom without entering it. Inside, Bill was lying on the bed, still alive but in critical condition. He was rushed to the hospital, where he later passed away. The cause of death was clear: a weapon injury to the head. Beside him lay a weapon in a pool of blood. Initially, investigators suspected that he had harmed himself, but they decided to carry out a more thorough investigation before reaching any conclusions. Forensic experts began analyzing the scene. The unusually large volume of blood warranted a detailed investigation. Blood spatters were found on much of the furniture, on the wall near the bed, and even on the ceiling fan. Fortunately, a blood spatter expert was brought in to assist. The expert confirmed that Bill had died from a single wound to the head. The only fingerprints found on the weapon during testing were Bill's. Susie has consistently maintained her perspective on the story since the beginning, asserting that Bill suffered from prolonged depression, had a tendency to harm himself, and had expressed these thoughts to multiple people on several occasions. Some of her statements were corroborated by her relatives and friends, as well as Bill's. Bill, a businessman, had been facing mounting challenges in managing his dealership, which seemed to have worsened his mental health. However, Susie's behavior raised significant doubts. She does not seem to be a grieving widow. Instead, she discusses her husband's death calmly, as though it were merely a trivial matter. Still, this wasn't the primary reason investigators began to scrutinize her further. The most shocking detail emerged in the 12 hours following Bill's death. During this time, Jim, Bill's brother, arrived at Bill's residence intending to speak with Susie, offer her support, and try to piece together what had happened by observing the scene. To his surprise, when Jim went upstairs, he heard music and the laughter of women. When he knocked, Susie came out casually and explained that she was hosting a party with friends. Jim found her behavior to be deeply inappropriate and upsetting. Later, Jim became one of Susie's most vocal critics as she desperately tried to prove her innocence. It was discovered that the women attending the gathering had removed all the furniture and carpeting from the bedroom. Not only were they listening to music and socializing, but the most alarming revelation was that they had repainted the bedroom a different color. Police viewed these actions as obvious attempts to interfere with evidence. Despite these suspicious actions, the blood expert successfully reconstructed the sequence of the incident. It is now clear that the case had nothing to do with Bill's self-harm. Detectives became convinced that Susie was the one who had pulled the trigger. Based on evidence collected on the first day, there appeared to be little doubt remaining. The focus then shifted to the remaining pieces of furniture and the nightgown Susie had been wearing. After thorough analysis, the expert concluded that Bill had been murdered by his wife, who had attacked him in the head while he was asleep. Susie was shocked when accused and immediately sought legal help by hiring a lawyer. The financial difficulties in their family's marriage have been confirmed by multiple sources. Susie said that Bill's unsuccessful attempt to obtain a bank loan led him to harm himself. Bill's family was aware of his dire financial situation, but not everyone believed that Susie was completely innocent. Detectives interviewed a loan officer at the bank who had interacted with Bill. The officer recounted how Bill had visited the bank in a deeply distraught state, even breaking down in tears. Bill reportedly stated that, without approval for a $200,000 loan, he would die. Unfortunately, Bill's financial situation was bleak, and his loan application was rejected. The loan officer had no choice but to turn him down. Numerous witnesses attested to Bill's desperation and emotional turmoil. Despite this evidence of Bill's deteriorating mental health, suspicions about Susie remained strong. Her behavior following her husband's death was widely perceived as celebratory rather than mournful. This interpretation led to widespread public condemnation and further distrust of her character. However, her lawyer firmly maintained her innocence. Bill Mowbray, a businessman, applied for a bank loan to keep his business running and pay off existing debts. However, the bank's refusal devastated him. That evening, he returned home deeply distressed and barely interacted with anyone. Susie did her best to console him, but her efforts did little to ease his despair. In the final days of his life, Bill fell into a severe depression as he desperately searched for a solution to his financial crisis. Later, Susie shared that after this incident, Bill frequently spoke about ending his life. She tried to support him by accompanying him to a psychotherapist. The lawyer worked to find evidence that substantiated Susie's claims, and succeeded. Several of Bill's longtime friends revealed that, approximately a decade before the tragedy, Bill had attempted to end his life. This had occurred in the 1970s, before Susie and Bill married, which explained why Susie had never mentioned it. After meeting Susie, his life seemed to improve, and those close to him believed that his past struggles had been overcome. This information further reinforces the narrative that Bill has a history of self-harm. The defense attorney believed this evidence would strongly support Susie if the case went to trial. He dismissed the notion that Susie was implicated in the crime by the gathering at their house following the tragedy. Furthermore, he argued that the prosecution's case relied solely on circumstantial evidence, which could be easily challenged. Susie's unusual behavior was not enough to indicate that she might resort to violence. Bill's family, however, argued that Susie's actions demonstrated a complete lack of empathy toward him. Meanwhile, an outraged Jim demanded justice for Bill and insisted that the killer be held responsible. Investigators suspect that someone else may have been involved in the crime and are questioning the circumstances surrounding the incident. Specifically, they were puzzled why Bill chose to end his life while lying next to his wife in bed. Typically, individuals who wish to end their lives tend to prefer doing so in solitude. If Bill were to choose to end his own life, he would have two methods to consider: either keeping a loaded weapon nearby, such as placing it by his bed or under his pillow, or waking up in the middle of the night, retrieving the weapon, and returning to bed before using it. Susie claimed she didn't notice Bill getting up at night, though it's possible she simply didn't wake up. She mentioned that she had once handled her husband's weapon after discovering it under the pillow. She explained that he kept it in the bedroom for self-defense, adding that such behavior was typical among Texans. Detectives, however, questioned why there were no fingerprints on the weapon if Susie had truly picked it up. Susie claimed that Bill regularly cleaned and wiped the weapon, but investigators remained skeptical. They began scrutinizing the dynamics of Susie's and Bill's relationship. During the inquiry, they discovered that she had multiple extramarital affairs during her marriage, and, importantly, Bill was aware of them. After numerous acts of infidelity, she and her children had left him and moved to Austin. However, Bill eventually persuaded her to return, and they resumed living together. Despite this reconciliation, many believed the relationship remained deeply strained. Susie and Bill were preparing for a divorce and discussing how to divide their assets, which created significant tension and might have given her a motive to murder her husband. Susie's behavior following the incident raised further suspicions. After the incident, upon realizing that her husband was seriously injured but still alive, she chose not to call an ambulance, a decision that might have increased his chances of survival. Instead, she called a colleague, Bill Luke Roy. Susie claimed she was confused and unsure of what to do in such a situation, so she sought advice from a family friend. This initially led some to speculate that Luke might have been involved in the crime, though no evidence supported this theory. According to Luke, Susie's voice lacked any signs of panic during their phone call. Nonetheless, Luke advised her to contact emergency services, which Susie did without hesitation after speaking with him. When experts investigated the scene and examined Bill's body, they discovered a bullet wound in his left hand. Strangely, despite the close-range attack, Susie, Bill's wife, was not covered in blood. Forensic experts noted that an attack at point-blank range typically produces small blood droplets. However, Bill's right hand was found neatly tucked beneath the pillow, which makes the possibility of him causing harm to himself in this manner highly unlikely. The prosecution built a strong case with a solid motive: financial gain. Susie, Bill's wife, appeared to benefit greatly from her husband's death, particularly in terms of insurance. Shortly before his death, Bill had made significant changes to his insurance policy. He increased the payout amount to nearly $2 million but removed Susie as a beneficiary. Instead, he designated the payout to his daughter from a previous marriage, Christine. Susie had even contacted the insurance company in advance to confirm the details of the policy. Crucially, these changes to the policy were set to take effect just days after Bill's death. During her call with the insurance company, Susie uncovered crucial information, which indirectly pointed to the possibility of a motive to act quickly. With Bill weighed down by financial troubles, his death could secure the money needed to resolve their outstanding debts. Apparently, Bill had removed Susie from the beneficiary list due to a lack of trust in her and instead sought to provide lifelong financial security for his daughter. This situation raised several troubling implications. Firstly, if Bill had planned his own death, he likely would have waited for the amended insurance policy to officially take effect, which would have occurred in just a few days. Furthermore, as someone knowledgeable in legal and financial matters, he would have been aware of Texas laws regarding voluntary death. Specifically, insurance policies do not pay out compensation to beneficiaries if the insured dies voluntarily within 2 years of the policy's activation. This means all of Bill's intentions to secure his daughter's future were doomed from the outset. Detectives believed that Bill had no intention of ending his life willingly. When he spoke about such matters, it was likely to evoke pity or manipulate others, such as persuading the bank to grant him a loan. However, given the strange circumstances surrounding his death, it seemed he didn't end his life himself. Someone might have helped him. Based on circumstantial evidence, Susie was arrested and charged with her husband's murder. At the trial, a key forensic method was used: blood spatter analysis. This technique, first introduced in the 1950s by Herbert MacDonald, played a critical role in providing evidence and substantiating the charges. MacDonald himself testified during Susie's trial, offering essential insights. Blood spatter analysis had been a foundational method in the U.S. justice system and widely accepted for years. However, in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences raised doubts about its reliability, emphasizing that accurate and meaningful use of the analysis requires significant expertise and experience. Evidence in Bill's murder case was analyzed by inexperienced experts, but this oversight was overlooked during the trial. Although blood sample analysis has been heavily criticized, it remains valuable and continues to be used, now exclusively by highly qualified and experienced specialists. In the past, doubts about this method had led to the reconsideration of several convictions. However, by the time of Susie's case, Herbert MacDonald's method was widely accepted and largely unquestioned. During the trial, Susie's ex-husband defended her, stating that he had never observed any signs of aggression throughout their relationship. He also stated that Susie was not even aware of how to use a weapon. Additionally, a family friend named Luke, Bill's business partner and Susie's initial point of contact after the incident, supported her and expressed his belief that Bill may have willingly ended his own life. Luke explained that he had planned to leave the car dealership due to work-related issues, and this decision had deeply affected Bill. In the final days of Bill's life, he reportedly struggled with loneliness. The prosecutor's office persisted in proving its case. To strengthen its argument, it presented the marital bed as evidence during the trial, complete with 2 mannequins representing Bill and Susie, as well as traces of Bill's blood that were still visible. This allowed the prosecution to vividly illustrate its version of what transpired on that tragic night. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury ultimately convicted Susie of murder, sentencing her on June 5, 1988, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict, Susie still had a group of supporters who believed in her innocence, including her son, Wade, and her daughter from a previous marriage. Both worked tirelessly to overturn the conviction, firmly convinced that Susie had stood by her husband until the very end and was incapable of violence against him. While Susie served time in prison, Wade enrolled in law school and dedicated himself to meticulously reviewing the case. He searched for errors or misconduct by the prosecution and investigators, hoping to find grounds for an appeal. Wade collaborated closely with his mother's lawyer to challenge the verdict and fight for justice. The case required processing a massive amount of complex information, which made the effort time-consuming. Wade was determined to secure justice as Susie had already spent 8 years in prison. Eventually, Susie's lawyer submitted a critical appeal that could not be dismissed. During the prosecution's case, the blood spatter analysis played a key role, but serious concerns emerged about whether the forensic expert had been qualified to handle this aspect. The expert had examined over 40 stains found on the nightgown. Interestingly, the prosecution's main piece of evidence turned out to be its biggest weakness. The defense disputed the accuracy of the tests conducted on the nightgown, arguing that various substances, not just blood, could cause the fabric to glow. Moreover, the nightgown had never been specifically tested for blood, and since it was no longer available, its credibility as evidence was entirely compromised. The appeal was accepted, leading to a thorough reconsideration of the evidence before the 1990 retrial. The absence of blood spatter on the weapon can be explained as follows. The gunshot to Bill's left arm likely occurred while he was holding the weapon under the pillow, with his left hand positioned on the opposite side of his head. The shot caused an exit wound. Certain actions of the experts during the retrial seemed questionable. For instance, the forensic expert who conducted Bill's autopsy made a key statement. Although he admitted that he could not be absolutely certain Susie had killed Bill, he maintained, perhaps to protect his reputation, that Bill could not have harmed himself without external assistance. Given that only Bill and Susie were in the house, Susie was naturally seen as the prime suspect. Wade's legal studies and collaboration with attorneys proved invaluable. Together, they uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that violated Susie's constitutional right to a fair trial. A major revelation emerged when the prosecution brought in Herbert McDonald to re-examine Susie's nightgown and the prior findings. Contrary to the prosecutor's expectations, McDonald decisively refuted the arguments supporting Susie's guilt. However, rather than sharing McDonald's expert opinion, the prosecution deliberately concealed it and continued relying on the flawed evidence against Susie. Wade played a vital role in the fight for his mother's freedom. He now faced the challenge of presenting his findings to convince the jury. His analysis revealed deception on the prosecution's part, which violated the Brady Rule, a requirement for prosecutors to disclose all evidence that could potentially exonerate the defendant. McDonald's findings were pivotal in exposing this misconduct. Finally, Susie's day in court arrived in January 1998. By then, the once vibrant woman had been deeply affected by her years in prison, reduced to a shadow of her former self. Yet, in her weary eyes, there remained a glimmer of hope. She continued to steadfastly maintain her innocence. Susie's friends, who attended the same unusual gathering where the bedroom was repainted after her husband's death, described the event as an odd prank. They explained that it was initiated by a woman attempting to cover up the unsettling red stains in the room. According to them, Susie was unaware that her actions would later lead to accusations of evidence tampering. Both friends defended her, with one stating that the room had not been cordoned off with police tape and no warning had been issued that the investigation was ongoing. In fact, investigators initially concluded that Bill's death was a result of self-harm and showed little interest in the scene. They had planned to close the case and archive it, allowing Susie to remain in the house without implementing any security measures, such as sealing the room with police tape. The other friend explained that the group merely wanted to help Susie, who hesitated to let her children return to a bedroom stained with blood. Influenced by alcohol, they decided to repaint the room before the kids came home. Neither friend believed that Susie was guilty of any wrongdoing. During the retrial, an unqualified expert who had analyzed Susie's nightgown admitted that his original testimony at her first trial was baseless and lacked scientific foundation. Forensic expert Herbert McDonald reviewed the flawed methods used in the investigation and expressed disbelief. The stains were measured visually without proper tools, and there was no confirmation that the stains were even blood. As a result, the evidence was deemed unconvincing. Susie's lawyer presented a compelling argument during the trial, which led the jury to reconsider their stance. They began to entertain the possibility that Bill, Susie's husband, had voluntarily chosen to end his own life. Substantial evidence later emerged, outweighing the vague testimonies provided by several of Bill's friends. The defense strategy focused on one key factor underlying the tragedy: Bill's financial difficulties. After his loan application was denied, his business faced imminent collapse, pushing his family close to poverty. To ensure that his daughter from a previous marriage would receive a larger insurance payout, Bill is said to have decided to end his own life. He spent his remaining savings on increasing the life insurance payout for her. Bill's decision not to wait just a few additional days may have been driven by severe depression or a sudden deterioration in his mental health, which could have left him incapable of fully understanding the legal implications. Accounts of Bill's behavior in the days leading up to his death supported this conclusion. The defense attorney believed their case had been effectively argued. However, during the closing arguments, Susie unexpectedly lost control. As the prosecution delivered its final remarks, she screamed that she had not killed her husband and collapsed in tears. This emotional outburst took everyone by surprise. On one hand, the jury recognized the sincerity in Susie's tears and assertions of innocence. On the other hand, her uncontrolled aggression complicated the situation. Deliberations over the verdict lasted for 4 hours of tense uncertainty. Although no definitive resolution was reached regarding Susie's guilt or innocence, she was ultimately acquitted of all charges on January 23, 1998. Despite her acquittal, she continued to face opposition, with critics focusing heavily on her behavior throughout the trial. While Susie's actions were undoubtedly unusual at times, her supporters, including her son and daughter, attributed her behavior to the emotional toll and stress she endured during the ordeal. Her opponents, however, claimed that her outburst during the trial was a calculated attempt to manipulate the jury. In contrast, her lawyer argued that the outburst was unplanned, insisting that such a risky tactic would have been ill-advised, particularly since the defense had already presented substantial evidence that might have backfired with the jury. During subsequent hearings, it was revealed that the nightgown had never been used as evidence. This omission raised concerns among the investigative team, as items of such significance rarely vanish without explanation. Speculation arose that the prosecution, facing heavy criticism for their strategy, may have intentionally disposed of the nightgown to prevent further examination. This theory gained traction as many believed the nightgown might have undermined their case, particularly given the opinion of Herbert MacDonald, whose expertise could have discredited their claims. Faced with mounting challenges, the prosecution seemingly had no viable path to continue their case. Susie Mowbray was acquitted on her 50th birthday, turning the occasion into a celebratory milestone. She expressed her gratitude to her son, Wade, describing it as the best anniversary gift she had ever received. In a 2001 interview, she reflected on her release, noting that others who had been wrongfully convicted alongside her had already been freed for 3 years. Susie had spent nearly a decade in prison and shared her hope that her children would feel proud of their mother. However, not everyone supported the verdict. Bill's first wife and his daughter, Christine, believed the outcome was unjust, remaining convinced that Susie had evaded accountability for murder. After Bill's death, his first wife revealed that Susie had urgently sold off all of his belongings to secure money. This led to a fierce legal battle between Bill's first wife and Susie over his inheritance. Ultimately, no one received the life insurance payout. Susie had once planned to write a book about her struggles, but since 2002, there has been no news about her. During that time, she went to court in an attempt to reclaim Bill's insurance payout, but she ultimately lost the case. Susie's son, Wade, initially pursued a legal career but eventually left the field to provide advice to other clergymen. Interestingly, Susie, who had previously sought public attention and appeared in her husband's advertising campaigns in the 1980s, completely disappeared from public view after her failed attempt to secure the insurance funds. She did not attend the TV show in 2021 that covered her case, though her lawyer did. The lawyer described her situation as a tragedy, emphasizing that the businessman's widow had spent so many years behind bars, which had destroyed her life, while insisting he had always believed in her innocence. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Pamela Vitali. Pamela Vitali was born on January 11, 1953, at Shepherd Field Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, to U.S. Air Force Sergeant Vern B. Ludke, an accomplished pianist, and Carol J. Crowley Ludke, a vocalist and artist. Pamela spent most of her life in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with her family, including her sister Tamara. In her later years, Pamela worked as a flight attendant and visited various countries around the world. She met her first husband, Mario Vitali, in London, and then moved in with him. They had 2 children, Mario A. Vitali and Marissa A. Vitali. Despite appearances, their relationship was not the best from the very beginning. When it began to collapse, Pamela decided to return to the United States, taking her 2 children with her. In 1978, she moved to California in search of a better life. As a single mother, she could no longer work as a flight attendant for obvious reasons, so she tried her hand in various fields of activity. She worked as an accountant, a salesperson in a fashion boutique, and a manager in a computer company, but felt that none of these jobs were right for her. Nevertheless, Pamela continued to work to provide for herself and her children while also attending film school at the University of California. This path became more successful. Pamela enjoyed realizing herself in cinema, and eventually, she became a producer. Pamela's career took off during her 3rd year of film school when she met her future second husband, Daniel Horowitz, who was a lawyer. He was a professional in his field, combining private practice with creative writing. Daniel wrote a script and saw great potential in it. He began looking for a producer who might be interested in his vision. His friend Tamara found out about the script and introduced them. Pamela became interested in the script, and thus a romance blossomed. A month later, she moved closer to him, and they began working together. Daniel and Pamela prospered financially. Thanks to Daniel's advocacy work, he gained popularity, which brought him many famous and wealthy clients. He frequently commented on high-profile criminal cases on television, even weighing in on the Michael Jackson case. Their inner circle knew Daniel and Pamela as happy people who sincerely loved each other, got along well. They seemed not just like spouses but also like best friends who understood each other perfectly. They had a bright future ahead of them. The next step they decided to take was to buy a big house together, unaware of how tragically their happiness could end. Around 6 p.m. on October 15, 2005, Daniel returned home after work. At that time, they lived in a prestigious area of a small town located approximately 30 kilometers from the city. Daniel had recently acquired a plot of land and moved in with his wife, while her children had already grown up and were living separately. Though they were a wealthy couple, they were living in a trailer because their dream home was still under construction. They were so close to realizing this dream that they were willing to endure any inconvenience. When Daniel returned home, he immediately noticed something odd. Pamela's car was near the trailer, although she should still have been at dance class. He initially brushed it off, thinking she had simply returned home early. Daniel took 2 bags of groceries and approached the trailer door, but froze in place as he saw a large stain of blood on the ground. His heart raced, but he tried to shake the thought away. However, when he opened the door and went inside, he found his wife on the floor in a fetal position, covered in blood. Daniel knew how to provide first aid, so he leaned over her body to turn her over. In that moment, he realized she was dead. She was cold to the touch and clearly had died several hours prior. Rigor mortis had already set in. He called emergency services and reported the incident. After hanging up, he leaned over his wife's body again and screamed so loudly that neighbors all over the area heard his heartbreaking cries. On the morning of the tragedy, apparently, someone had come in early that morning. Pamela opened the door, which led to an altercation. She managed to push a large TV toward her attacker, probably trying to defend herself, leaving traces of her bloody hands on it. Pamela desperately fought for her life. A mix of her blood and the attacker's was found on the floor. Particles of skin from the murderer were found under her fingernails. Despite her desperate resistance, Pamela was brutally beaten to death. The forensic examination revealed that Pamela had a broken nose and several knocked-out teeth. She was killed by blunt force trauma to the head, which caused massive hemorrhaging in her brain. The attack was so brutal that portions of her scalp were torn off, and there were fractures on her skull. The attackers even inflicted wounds on her stomach and left a symbol on her back that looked like the letter H. It appeared that the attacker had spent considerable time in the trailer with Pamela. The detectives discovered that someone had taken the water and bathed, leaving behind smeared blood. It was possible that some of the cuts on Pamela were inflicted after her death. Naturally, detectives first suspected Daniel himself, as this crime was committed with extreme cruelty. In such cases, it is often found that the guilty party is a close person with a motive. In any case, Daniel had a reliable alibi. Several people could vouch for him that day. It was a usual day for a lawyer. He left the house around 8 a.m. and did not return until 6 p.m. The high-profile murder of a famous female producer attracted wide media attention, and this case was actively covered on television. Numerous rumors immediately began to circulate. It was about a prosperous, developing area with wealthy residents, where such a massacre of an innocent person was least expected. The local community wanted to know the truth before the next attack happened. It was necessary to stop the bloodthirsty criminal. Pamela was found in her underwear. Here were no traces of a break-in, which confirmed their suspicions. Only a husband or lover came to mind. There was no evidence of abuse, and nothing was missing from the trailer, despite the fact that the wealthy couple had a lot of valuables inside. This meant that theories involving abuse or robbery were unlikely. Nevertheless, even after the alibi was confirmed, the rumors did not stop. Some speculated that Daniel could not have committed the crime himself. As a lawyer, he constantly communicated with potentially dangerous people who could easily have carried out something similar at his behest. Detectives carefully checked this theory, analyzing the data on his computer and phone. However, they found no grounds for suspicion against Daniel and could not confirm that Pamela had a lover. Nevertheless, law enforcement officials did not abandon the idea that the criminal must have been well acquainted with Pamela. He was probably a resident of the area. This theory was not without foundation, as a statement was found in a trailer indicating harassment. According to Daniel, they had been persecuted for quite some time. As a result, he even left a restraining order against one of their neighbors to Pamela, but he never filed the documents with the court. Daniel admitted that there had been difficulties with one local resident who did not like them. However, he managed to reach an agreement with this person after weeks of bickering, and the problems ended without filing a complaint. He kept the restraining order just in case something happened again. The check on this neighbor yielded no results, as he was away at the time of the attack and had a reliable alibi. He was subsequently excluded from the list of suspects. On the day Pamela was buried, a press conference was held, during which the police announced the arrest of the probable killer. It turned out to be a 16-year-old teenager named Scott Dileski, who was just 2 weeks away from his 17th birthday. He did not personally know Pamela's family, but the victim's husband, Daniel, had helped his mother, Esther Fielding, with paperwork. Scott's family was experiencing financial difficulties, so Daniel did not even take money for his assistance. This was the unexpected price for his kindness. Scott Dileski was born in San Francisco. Soon after his birth, his parents divorced, and Esther raised the boy. Quite quickly, she found a new partner and remarried. Scott claimed that his stepfather could be cruel, but his mother had never witnessed any such incidents. Information about the early years of his life is contradictory. Some claim his stepfather could indeed be cruel, while others deny it. There is also conflicting information about the mother's attitude towards her son. Despite the difficulties with the family, when his father offered for him to move in, Scott refused. Shortly before Pamela's murder, Esther got divorced again, leading to financial problems and an acute housing crisis. She and her son were left without a place to stay, and Esther desperately sought employment. But finding a job while dealing with housing issues proved difficult. Fortunately, friends extended a helping hand, offering to temporarily move in with them. Esther and Scott were offered to settle on a property in a trailer. In fact, the living conditions were modest, but they had no choice. During this period, Scott was going through a transitional phase, showing signs of rebelliousness. As a pleasant but peculiar young man, He had previously been a Boy Scout and a baseball player. Before moving, he had studied quite well. Coincidentally, a chain of tragic events had been triggered by the loss of a loved one. Shortly before the move, Scott's half-sister died in a car accident. This serious incident caused significant psychological distress for him. Many believe that his mother's indifference led to negative changes in his behavior, but she did not remain idle. She tried to support her family during that time. Scott became increasingly detached from society and closed off, exhibiting low energy. His behavior also took on some strange characteristics. For instance, he once drew a pentagram and danced around it. This was only an external manifestation of his problems, while those who constantly interacted with Scott did not notice any significant alarming changes in his behavior. He became increasingly immersed in dark thoughts and began to write disturbing poems, probably to attract his mother's attention. Esther was sure that her son simply exhibited quirks. She did not speak of him as a difficult child. She believed that Scott was going through a challenging period in his own way due to the death of his sister and the financial difficulties their family faced. Esther remembered how he previously could not even stand the sight of blood, but when the police first spoke to him, he claimed that at the age of 12, he had tried various illegal substances. Gradually, Scott showed an increasing interest in crime. He read a lot about serial killers and school shootings, spoke more often about these topics, showing an unhealthy fascination. Friends noticed that he was becoming increasingly distant. When detectives looked at Scott's computer, even more questions arose. They found very disturbing content, particularly concerning the practice of cutting up animals. One of Scott's friends, whom he met after the move, said that not long before Pamela's murder, they had decided to sell a truck, viewing it as the only way to improve their lives financially. The teenagers needed money. A solution was found quickly. They lived in a wealthy area, so they decided to put in some effort to earn the necessary amount. Scott, whose demeanor was becoming increasingly gloomy, decided to take the path of crime and rob a house, launching another chain of alarming events. Shortly before Pamela's death, a woman named Karen contacted the police, noting that a purchase she did not make had been charged to her credit card. An order from an online store was delivered to a nearby house where Esther and Scott lived. Someone from this household had purchased special lighting equipment for growing illegal plants. All of this led to Esther, as it was under her name that the suspicious order was made. However, Karen did not want to contact the police immediately. Esther was outraged by what she perceived as slander and believed that they were trying to put her in a bad light. Esther denied that she had ordered anything similar on the internet. However, the property owner suspected something was wrong and checked Scott's computer. Under pressure, Scott quickly confessed that he had come up with a fraudulent plan involving credit cards and that he had ordered the lighting fixtures. Soon after, Pamela died. In response to this incident, the parents of Scott's accomplice pressured him to confess to the scam, fearing that the young people could be involved in much more serious offenses. Maybe, the fraud involving the credit cards led to a robbery that ended in murder. His parents insisted that the accomplice go to the police station and confess everything. Interestingly, when he left the interrogation room, the detectives had in their hands a story that Scott had killed his neighbor. The young man who testified about all of this received immunity from prosecution for providing testimony. It was he who had pushed Scott into fraud and suggested that he engage in illegal activities. When the police came to arrest Scott, he was not at home. Esther was detained and admitted that her son was at a nearby location with his girlfriend. Less than an hour later, he was arrested along with Esther, who was also considered a participant. Esther and her son were held in custody for destruction of evidence and possibly for murder. Bail for Esther was set at $500. The suspicion against her arose from the story about a backpack that contained details of accounts and numbers of people from whom Scott had stolen money or planned to steal. Several people had already suffered due to the swindler. Esther's actions were viewed as criminal. The night after Pamela's murder, she contacted Scott to inform him of police activity in their area and asked him not to come home. Scott told her about the records and the backpack containing the data, asking her to throw it away, which she did. Esther insisted she was simply afraid for her son's safety. Scott was with his girlfriend, named Jenna Reddy. She later also ended up at the station, even testified against her boyfriend at the trial. She stated that he often talked about different ways of killing, for example, that shooting a person is less painful than beating them to death with a bat or stabbing them with a knife. According to Jenna, Scott often wondered how long it takes to beat someone to death and was obsessed with this topic. After the crime against Pamela, when they pressured Esther, she quickly agreed to cooperate with the authorities, receiving guarantees for protection from criminal prosecution. She denied any connection to her neighbor's murder. However, opinions about Esther were very conflicting. Some believed that she lived for her son, while her ex-husband did not share this belief. In any case, Esther changed her testimony, clearly trying to justify herself. Mainly, Esther talked about the backpack that she had thrown away. She did not know all the contents but believed they were unrelated to the murder. There was data on all the people who had become victims of Scott's fraudulent scheme. Esther helped find some items they had tried to destroy, including shoes and gloves that had blood stains on them. An examination showed that the items contained the blood of Pamela. Scott also left a shoe imprint at the crime scene, and samples of his DNA were found on Pamela's foot. In Scott's room, handwritten notes were discovered, some of which contained information about accounts of people who were likely to have been deceived by the same fraudulent scheme. In addition, there were plans to kidnap people. Apparently, Scott was ready to make money by any means, regardless of the seriousness of the crimes. There were also descriptions of how to get rid of evidence. All this confirmed the guilt of him. There were many coincidences. Even the symbol carved on the back of Pamela resembled the signatures that Scott used. A public defender was appointed at the beginning of the trial. However, there was also strong evidence against Scott that came to court. He was the complete opposite of his Gothic image during the investigation. All this was part of the defense attorney's strategy to humanize a dangerous killer in front of the jury in order to acquit him. According to Scott's version of events told before the trial, on the day of the murder, he decided to take a walk towards a local waterfall. He returned from this walk with serious injuries. According to him, while he was walking, he accidentally met a strange woman who attacked him, resulting in his injuries. By an amazing coincidence, she was Pamela, so the blood stains on both her and his clothes matched the DNA of the victim. He claimed that she had clawed his face, cut his wrist, and injured his hand. When he was arrested, the injuries were still fresh. Naturally, his story sounded unrealistic. Why would Pamela attack Scott at the waterfall? What happened to her afterward? How she ended up in the house, and who attacked her were all major questions. The evidence against Scott included all his browser queries related to animal cruelty, his obsession with crimes, plans for murder, material evidence, blood on items, confessions from friends of his girlfriend and her mother. The lawyer tried to highlight his best qualities and described him as a decent guy, but against the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecutor's office, it seemed futile. The only point that might have raised doubt, as stated by the lawyer, was the discovery of DNA samples. In addition to Scott's and Pamela's blood, traces of an unidentified person were found in the house. The defense attorney insisted that the detectives overlooked this evidence from the start and focused solely on proving Scott's guilt. The prosecution argued that the evidence against Scott was too substantial to be dismissed, while the evidence suggesting Scott's innocence was virtually insignificant. The jury went into deliberation to decide Scott's fate. It took them 18 hours to reach a decision, ultimately sparing him from the death penalty, as they chose to try him as a minor. It was assumed that he would serve the rest of his life in prison. Scott was found guilty of first-degree murder a month before the final round of hearings was held. Pamela's husband took the stand and stated that in his many years as a lawyer, he had represented at least 50 different murderers but had never seen a total lack of remorse like Scott's. Daniel believed that Scott had no redeeming qualities that would allow for parole eligibility. He deserved to be in prison for the rest of his life, and so it happened. Scott Dileski was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was to remain in a juvenile facility until he turned 18 and then be transferred to an adult prison. Immediately after Scott turned 18, he appealed to have his sentence reviewed, but his efforts were in vain. In 2009, Scott filed a claim that his rights had been violated. He wanted to change the venue of the hearing and claimed that some evidence which could refute the appeal was also rejected. The next attempt was made in 2011, where he pointed to evidence indicating the involvement of an unknown person in the murder, specifically claiming that the authorities did not even attempt to identify who owned all the DNA traces found in the trailer where Pamela died. He insisted that the nature of the crime indicated a personal motive. Scott himself allegedly did not know Pamela, and it made no sense for him to kill her, especially with such cruelty. Additionally, the detectives claimed that the criminal remained in the trailer for an extended period, consistent with the timeline, but Scott asserted that he had been at home during that time. Again, his arguments did not lead to any significant changes. Another appeal was filed in 2016, with Scott insisting that his life sentence was wrongful because he was a minor at the time of the crime. The appeal was accepted for consideration. During his imprisonment, state laws were revised to prohibit life sentences for minors without the possibility of parole, and he was automatically given the opportunity for early release after serving 25 years in prison. In 2030, Scott will have the chance to present his case for release. However, whether this release will be approved by the Commission remains uncertain. It is difficult to predict the outcome, but it is known that Scott became an exemplary prisoner. He did not drop out of school and continued to receive an education within the prison walls. Pamela's family stated that they would definitely be present at the parole board hearing to prevent him from being released, viewing him as an especially dangerous criminal. Daniel never finished building the house he dreamed of with his wife. He was forced to sell the land along with the partially built house because he simply wanted to forget everything that had happened and start life anew. Hello friends. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. The case of Amy Willard. Amy Ellen Willard was born on June 8, 1974, in Chester, Pennsylvania, a small town with a population of around 30,000. She is the youngest child in her family, with an older brother named Tim and a sister who was born a year prior. Paul Willard, their father, was a police officer who enforced strict discipline on his children to prepare them for life's hardships. He not only taught them self-defense but also placed a high value on safety. Their mother, Gail, worked as a nurse at a hospital. She understood the risks of carelessness and fully supported her husband's efforts to enhance security. Despite sharing similar views on life, Amy's parents divorced, leading to the disintegration of the family. Amy and her siblings stayed with their mother but would occasionally visit their father. During this period, Amy's older sister, Vera, became an important part of her life. Vera was an active member of her church and participated in various religious activities. The family members often supported one another in areas such as safety, helping others, and showing compassion, especially in light of the rising crime rate at that time. For this reason, their father taught the children self-defense lessons, while their mother taught them basic first aid skills. Amy began attending an all-girls high school where she was noted for her athletic talent. The school had championship teams in basketball, soccer, and cross-country. She participated in all three sports and had great success, especially in soccer. She also excelled in lacrosse and was named the captain of the basketball team. Her coach considered her one of the best athletes he had ever trained. In lacrosse, it was believed she had the potential to compete at the national level. After graduating, Amy enrolled at the University of George Mason, leaving her parents' home behind. While she played football at the university, she found her greatest success in lacrosse. She quickly attracted attention by breaking long-standing records and became a star player on a college team. Despite her achievements in sports and academics, she remained humble and a bit shy. In the summer of 1996, Amy was focused on her training as she prepared for the upcoming academic and sports season. She continued attending her classes regularly and participating in training sessions. At the same time, she sought a summer job to earn some extra money. She successfully balanced everything, which is why she visited her mother in June 1996 before going to the lake house to meet her friends at a bar. On the morning of June 20, 1996, around 2 a.m., an ambulance crew was driving on a highway toward Marple Township, Pennsylvania, when they spotted a Honda parked unusually on the roadside. Concerned, they decided to investigate the vehicle. They found that it was empty, The doors were wide open, the engine was running, and the headlights were on. The situation seemed strange, as if the owner had just stepped away but was expected to return. As they got closer to the car, they noticed blood nearby. Blood was seeping from the passenger area near the driver's door, forming a large pool. The ambulance team quickly contacted the police. Within minutes, forensic experts and detectives arrived to investigate the potential crime scene. They discovered a bloodied stone and a crowbar, which left a clear trail of bloodstains. The car itself showed no signs of damage, indicating that the driver could not have made a sudden stop. As they continued to search the area around the vehicle, they found even more blood, along with evidence of dragging. Initially, they thought the driver of the Honda might have struck someone, but this theory was soon dismissed. Nearby, investigators found tire tread marks from another vehicle. Unfortunately, rain began to fall, which could erase many of the remaining traces. Photographs of the scene were taken quickly. Search teams began scouring the surrounding area. Given the amount of blood, it was likely that there was a victim nearby, or even several victims. About a kilometer away from the abandoned car, investigators found sneakers and underwear, although it was unclear if they were connected to the case. A check of the car's license plate revealed that it belonged to a woman named Gail Willard. Unable to contact Gail, there were initial suspicions that she might be a victim of the attack. Reports indicated that Gail, a 40-year-old woman who worked as a nurse in the emergency room, was missing. However, the police later confirmed that she was not actually missing but was simply resting at her beach house in New Jersey, about an hour and a half away. She left for the beach house a few days earlier, on June 20th. When the police called the phone number she had left behind, they found that she was safe. Gail was, however, anxious about her car, which she had left with her 22-year-old daughter, Amy. Since Amy had not been in contact, Gail provided a detailed description of her to the authorities. They then reached out to Amy's father, Paul, who is a police sergeant in a nearby county. Gail went to the police station and stayed there for the rest of the day to assist with the investigation concerning her car. The car is new, but Gail discovered a large scratch on the rear bumper. This scratch appeared to have been caused by another vehicle or a heavy object colliding with it, which made her feel suspicious. Gail spoke with the police, providing them with details about her daughter. Amy had been living outside of Pennsylvania but returned for the summer holidays. She planned to meet old friends on June 19, 1996, for a reunion with former classmates who were now attending different schools. They intended to gather at a popular bar among youth and students, Smoky Joe's. Gail shared the contact numbers of the friends who would be with her daughter that evening. The detectives visited the bar to interview the staff, but everyone there had difficulty remembering Amy. With many customers visiting daily, it was difficult for them to recall any specific person. Amy's friends confirmed that they had indeed been at Smoky Joe's, sitting in a corner, drinking and dancing. Since Amy had an important class at 8 the next morning, she decided to leave at 1:30 a.m. to get some rest. The rest of the group stayed behind and continued to enjoy their night. They had no idea what might have happened to Amy and didn't notice anything unusual. However, they did provide detectives with a description of her outfit. One notable detail was her t-shirt, which featured a large sunflower. This information became a key clue. From that point, a description of Amy was circulated across all media to gather more leads. Alarmed headlines began to surface in newspapers and on TV, sparking interest from the local community. Unfortunately, all appeals for information ended up being fruitless. The search continued around the bar, and police questioned witnesses to find any CCTV footage. Unfortunately, there were no cameras in the area, so this did not lead to any useful information. However, the discovery of underwear and sneakers led Gail, Amy's mother, to confirm that they belonged to her daughter without a doubt. This development increased the urgency of the situation. The police issued another public appeal to encourage potential witnesses to come forward. On the same day, a 20-year-old man named Andrew Kobach approached the police. He reported seeing an abandoned car that matched the description of Gail's Honda around 1 o'clock in the morning. He provided a detailed account of the circumstances, but his timing was questioned. The police suspected he might have misjudged the time, possibly not checking his watch or estimating it incorrectly. Nevertheless, this report made him a suspect. Detectives wondered why he hadn't alerted the police sooner if he noticed something unusual. Andrew could potentially be connected to Amy's disappearance since he was in the same area. He denied any involvement, stating he was working at a nearby bar called Smoky Joe's. With no other leads available, detectives considered the possibility that he had contacted the police to gauge the investigation's progress and mislead them. Andrew lived just 10 minutes away from the bar and came from a wealthy family, known for getting into trouble. He had a record of traffic violations and was arrested in 1994 for falsely reporting a fire, although the charges were later dropped. Friends claimed he had an obsessive desire to become a firefighter, which some found concerning. At around 5 p.m. on June 20th, in an empty lot in North Philadelphia, a group of children was walking when a boy in the group made a horrifying discovery while crossing the train tracks. They discovered the body of a girl lying in a fetal position, naked and concealed inside 2 large garbage bags. The children quickly informed nearby adults, who then called the police. When law enforcement arrived, it was clear that the girl had been murdered. A search of the surrounding area yielded no leads. Her identity was unknown, as the condition of her head made it difficult to check dental records. The only notable clue was a tattoo on her ankle. Detectives compiled a list of missing girls from the area and contacted their families for identification. That same evening, Gail recognized her daughter. Forensic experts confirmed the investigators' initial thoughts: the girl had been killed. Her skull was fractured, which caused severe bleeding and ultimately led to a stroke. The rapid blood loss meant her heart stopped within minutes. The violence inflicted on her was brutal. There were marks from shoe soles on her head, suggesting that the attacker had stomped on her. Additionally, there were numerous bruises across her body, along with defensive wounds and some unusual marks that could not be identified. Furthermore, Amy had been abused multiple times, potentially with a branch or another object of torture found nearby. There were no signs of blood or struggle at the scene, indicating that she was likely transported there after the crime was committed elsewhere. When the search team discovered her shoes and underwear, they were clean and dry. Detectives believed that the assailant returned to the area after Amy's death, scattering items to obscure evidence and mislead the investigation. During Amy's autopsy, traces of male biological fluid were found, which supports the suspicion of abuse. This evidence was collected and sent to a forensic lab to create a DNA profile. At that time, the technology was slower, so the results took weeks or even months to obtain. Meanwhile, the police continued searching for additional evidence. When the results of the initial tests arrived, it was confirmed that the blood found near the abandoned car belonged to Amy. Additionally, the items collected from the scene were also confirmed to be associated with her. The detectives then shifted their focus to the tire tread patterns found near Amy's car, hoping to identify the vehicle used by the perpetrator. An analysis of the photographs revealed the make and model of the tires, which are typically found on small cars. Unfortunately, this information was not enough to significantly narrow down the list of suspects, as no one in Amy's immediate circle drove such vehicles. The detectives examined the evidence from the crime scene and concluded that Amy had resisted fiercely. Her high athletic skills and the self-defense lessons taught by her father may have helped her escape the attack and move further at the scene. However, she may have lost consciousness due to blood loss. The attacker ambushed her in the area where her underwear and shoes were later discovered. It was unclear why she stopped at such a secluded spot. Gail's car was in perfect working condition, ruling out a breakdown as the reason for her stopping. Her father, a policeman, had repeatedly warned her about criminals who pose as victims on remote roads, hoping someone will stop to help. Given the dangerous nature of the area, Amy should have remembered this advice and avoided stopping. Investigators believe that Gail's car, Amy's mother's car, may have been struck while she was driving, forcing her to pull over. This led them to focus more on Andrew Kobach, who claimed he had seen an abandoned Honda. Detectives visited Andrew's neighborhood to gather more information about him. They discovered that he had worked at a company just a kilometer away from where the incident occurred shortly before the attack on Amy. Suspicion towards Andrew intensified after authorities spoke with a woman named Susan Sieber. Susan was Andrew's neighbor and a witness who noted that his interest in the fire service seemed more like an obsession than a career choice. He even used a police scanner and had installed flashing lights on his car. He even goes so far as to chase after fire trucks while they are on duty, which is quite strange. He also had a habit of parking his car in Susan's driveway, even though her house was across the street. When Susan became frustrated with this, she confronted him. However, to her surprise, the following day, the fire brigade was called to her address. The incident seems quite complicated, however, it was quickly resolved, possibly due to the connections and wealth of Andrew's father, who is very rich. Andrew only earns a temporary income, working at bars or clubs. Notably, during the time Amy was murdered, he was unemployed. Clearly, Andrew lied when he claimed he was working at a bar near Smokey Joe. But why would he do that if there was no suspicious reason? Detectives intended to hold Andrew accountable, but they needed more evidence. Friends described him as a lonely and introverted person. He is a nice guy, but very few people understand him because he doesn't socialize with others. Within his family, he is viewed as a failure. He has two older brothers. One is studying medicine and is quite successful, while the other works as a broker like their father. The blue and red lights flashing on his car at night gave him the opportunity to pose as a police officer. Authorities believe they have discovered how the murderer controlled the girl. They invited Andrew to the station for questioning, and he initially cooperated, even allowing detectives to search his car without a warrant. However, when detectives found very dirty handcuffs in the trunk, Andrew suddenly refused to answer more questions and requested a lawyer. This prompted the authorities to consider obtaining multiple warrants to continue searching both his car and his home. On June 25, 1996, they arrived at the Andrew family's house, waiting for a warrant to collect DNA samples. The news that the son of a wealthy broker was suspected in the brutal murder of a girl became a top story in the media. The car was sent to the forensic lab, but issues quickly arose. The tires did not match the model that forensic scientists had identified, and Andrew's DNA did not match any evidence found. Although Andrew appeared to be the prime suspect, investigators had to eliminate him from the list of suspects. The theory that the killer might have impersonated a police officer also hit a dead end. The community was alarmed and demanded that the killer be caught, with some suggesting that the perpetrator could be an actual law enforcement officer. Consequently, a search was conducted to identify potential wolves in uniform. However, this line of inquiry also did not yield results. The public outcry grew to the point that new regulations were needed to prohibit police officers from stopping vehicles without displaying their badges. On September 23, 1996, a woman visited the police station to report an assault she had experienced on the same highway. While she was driving, two men wearing ski masks suddenly opened her car door, forced her into the back seat, and abused her. They had also chased her car before the attack, and while there were two attackers, the driver did not exit the vehicle during the incident. Detectives decided that this was likely a copycat crime unrelated to Amy's murder, as they had left her alive. They were eventually caught, but they were not linked to Amy's murder. In an effort to find clues, detectives reviewed the timeline of crimes and discovered a similar incident from 1994. In that case, a random driver used a flashing light on his car to stop a motorist and asked for her driver's license. When she questioned why he wasn't in a police uniform, he struck her in the face and tried to pull her from the car. Luckily, the victim managed to fight back and escape, and she reported the incident to the police. Unfortunately, the attacker was never identified or caught. Detectives even appeared on a television show about various crime cases, which led to many new clues. Unfortunately, they all proved to be false leads. By 1997, the police still had no answers. In May of that year, another alarming incident occurred. A student named Patty Jordan was enjoying time with friends at a bar and left alone after midnight. The next day, she shared a chilling experience, explaining that she noticed a car following her from the bar. The driver was speeding, which seemed suspicious. Despite her efforts to escape by breaking traffic laws, she couldn't shake the pursuit. When she slowed down, she felt the car hit her from behind. Terrified, Patty continued to drive, but when she stopped at a traffic light, the driver gestured for her to pull over. Instead of stopping, she accelerated, but the pursuing car overtook her and blocked her path. By some stroke of luck, she managed to escape and immediately went to the local police station to report the incident, providing the detectives with details, including the car's license plate and a description of the driver. The police checked the license plate and discovered that a 38-year-old man named Arthur Bomer had purchased the car with that license plate. When Patty was shown a photo of him, she recognized him as her stalker. She had seen him closely when he approached her car. A search of his records revealed that Arthur had a lengthy criminal history. Notably, he had committed murder in Nevada on July 25, 1977, when he was only 19. This crime originated from a dispute over a parking space, during which he attacked an innocent man. He was sentenced to life in prison but was released after just 11 years due to a reform. Arthur was released in 1990 and subsequently moved to Pennsylvania. A few months later, he stopped a random woman on the road, dragged her out of her car, and assaulted her. He should have returned to prison for violating his early release terms, but a strange coincidence prevented this. The woman died in an unrelated incident and could not testify against him in court, leading to the case being closed. On June 5, 1997, a woman called the police to report that an unknown intruder was attempting to break into her apartment. When the police arrived, they apprehended the man, who claimed to be Peter Thomas Love. However, fingerprint analysis revealed his true identity as Arthur Bomer. He was arrested for trespassing and illegal entry. A car near the location matched the description provided by a previous victim, Patty Jordan, but it had a license plate that belonged to another vehicle. This Ford was taken to the police station for questioning. Arthur became a suspect in the case of Amy. When investigators mentioned Amy's name, he refused to discuss anything related to the death penalty. The police took this as a confession to Amy's murder. Further investigation revealed that the Honda he was using, which had stolen license plates, belonged to Maria Cabuenos, a young woman who had been missing for 3 years. Marks on the bumper of Arthur's Honda resembled a collision with another car, matching scratches found on Amy's vehicle. Additionally, blood stains were discovered in the trunk. All evidence was collected and sent for examination. Arthur became the main suspect in the murder of Amy and the disappearance of Maria. He denied any wrongdoing and expressed his frustration to the media about being accused. His wife reported that he had been absent from home for 2 days starting June 19th. Arthur's brother mentioned that they often visited Smokey Joe's bar together. Arthur had a tendency to inappropriately approach women, sometimes spilling a drink or bumping into cars in parking lots just to initiate a conversation. Later, Arthur's mistress, Mary, came to the police station. She claimed that on June 19th, Arthur returned to her and recounted an attack he had experienced. He had pretended to be a police officer, but Mary realized he was lying. When he attacked the victim with a crowbar, he took her to a secluded area to hide the evidence. However, the police questioned Mary's credibility because her account closely mirrored news reports and didn't offer any new information. It seemed she might have ulterior motives for accusing him, as she later confessed to feeling upset after discovering he was married. Detectives collected evidence for the investigation and awaited a match with the existing DNA profile associated with the case. They concentrated on locating a Ford vehicle that had Honda license plate. Eventually, they discovered it in a landfill. Although the car was nearly corroded beyond recognition, investigators found traces of blood and other evidence indicating that the suspect had transported his victim in it. Remarkably, the blood found in the car belonged to Maria, and similar traces were found in Amy's vehicle. Arthur's connection to both crimes was further solidified when it was confirmed that the male bodily fluids found on Amy matched those of Arthur. On December 10, 1997, he was charged with first-degree murder and abuse while in custody before his trial. He attempted to end his life using a bedsheet, but the fabric tore under his weight. Arthur's trial was set for September 1998. After reviewing the prosecution's evidence and the defense's arguments, the jury began to deliberate. On October 1, 1998, Arthur Bomer was found guilty of Amy's murder. His attorney attempted to lessen the sentence, but the court determined that the death penalty was warranted. 3 months after his execution in January 1999, a man walking his dog in a field in Philadelphia discovered a human skull and reported it to the authorities. Forensic examination confirmed that the skull belonged to the missing Maria Cabuenos. Her body was located 20 kilometers from Arthur's residence, and the cause of her death was identified as blunt force trauma to the head. Detectives believe Arthur was responsible for her murder, as all evidence pointed to him. However, since he had already been executed, there was no opportunity to present the findings, and the case was officially closed. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Cassidy Goodson. Cassidy Goodson's early years were spent in a loving family in a quiet area of the small town of Lakeland, Florida, USA, which has a population of about 100,000 people. Those who knew her described her as a girl with great potential who was outgoing and successful in softball. Both of her parents worked hard for the good of the family. Their first priority was always to provide for their children. Cassidy had a sister and a brother, with whom she had quite close relationships. In her teens, Cassidy had no problems with her parents or the law. She did not use illegal substances, did not smoke, was athletic, and excelled academically. Cassidy helped her mother with housework, and every Sunday, she went with her family to church. Everyone who knew she believed that she had a great future. She was eager to study and planned to pursue a career. However, in the spring of 2012, significant changes occurred in the life of the 14-year-old teenager. Her brother and sister noticed that Cassidy began to behave differently than usual. First of all, she gained weight. However, her mother believed that this could be associated with hormonal changes during adolescence. The girl's clothing preferences changed as well. It seemed that Cassidy was very self-conscious about what was happening, so she began to wear baggy clothes that hid her figure. Cassidy did not even change clothes with her classmates before physical education. Against this backdrop, some people quickly began to suspect that she was pregnant, and rumors about this started to circulate at school. She did not admit it to her sister or best friends. In fact, she found herself in a delicate situation. She was afraid of her family's reaction. She felt great anxiety and decided to hide her pregnancy from her parents, as well as from everyone around her. Gradually, her belly began to grow. Cassidy gained weight but continued to stubbornly wear the same pants to avoid detection. Around the house, she wrapped herself in a blanket. The once smiling and sociable schoolgirl now spent most of her time alone in her room, hardly communicating with anyone. She stopped going to church to avoid catching the eye of acquaintances. Cassidy's sister, as well as her mother, Teresa, noticed strange changes in her behavior. Teresa tried to discuss the possibility of pregnancy with her daughter. Cassidy immediately rejected such assumptions. Her mother insisted that she take a pregnancy test to eliminate any doubts, but deep down, she did not think that Cassidy could keep something like this a secret. Teresa bought several tests, and Cassidy agreed to take them. Teresa trusted her daughter, so she did not attend the test with her. This proved to be very convenient for Cassidy, as she easily managed to deceive everyone, proving that she was not pregnant. Teresa's trust became a fatal mistake. She talked to her daughter about this topic, but Cassidy insisted that she did not need lectures on contraception because she was not intimate active and did not date boys. Teresa believed in her once again, continuing to wash her daughter's clothes every week and monitor her menstrual cycle. Around the same time, even the father began to notice Cassidy's uncharacteristic behavior. One day, when he saw her walking around the house wrapped in a blanket, he also had doubts. He tried to talk to her, as did the rest of the family, but Cassidy rejected any questions or suspicions. Her brother and sister also suspected something was wrong, particularly after the rumors that had spread around the school. They doubted that Cassidy had taken the pregnancy test honestly and even discussed their alarming assumptions with other family members. All of this reached their grandparents, but they too failed to get through to Cassidy, who continued to tell them that she had simply gained weight due to the transition period and now had a lot of complexes because of it. They believed her. By the middle of the summer, her belly had become so large that it was impossible to hide it with baggy clothes. She walked around wrapped in a blanket almost all day, but continued to insist that she was not pregnant. Cassidy ignored her loved ones and could even be rude in her responses. Realizing that it was impossible to get through to their daughter, her parents simply calmed down and continued to lead their usual lives. Of course, it is impossible to hide something like this forever, as the due date was approaching, and it all could turn into a terrible tragedy. On September 19, 2012, Teresa entered the bathroom after Cassidy had spent a long time in the shower. She noticed blood on the toilet and on the floor next to it. Alarmed, Teresa immediately suspected something was wrong and went to her daughter's room. There, she found Cassidy, who seemed exhausted. She was pale and looked sickly, but still refused to explain what was happening. Cassidy tried to act as if everything was fine. However, after discovering the blood, her mother insisted on taking her to the medical center's emergency room, where the doctors examined her daughter for a possible miscarriage. Cassidy eventually confessed to the doctors. After the examination, it was futile to deny it, so she admitted that she had indeed had a miscarriage. According to Cassidy, while she was sitting on the toilet, the fetus unexpectedly fell out, and she didn't have time to process what was happening. Allegedly, Cassidy accidentally washed the fetus away and only realized the gravity of the situation afterward. She was scared and didn't tell her mother about it. Cassidy received the necessary medical assistance, her wounds were treated, and she was sent home to recover. When Cassidy and her mother returned home, both tried not to talk about what had happened. Teresa provided her daughter with comprehensive support. On September 22, 2012, Teresa noticed a suspicious and unpleasant smell in Cassidy's room. Since Cassidy was not there, Teresa decided to do some cleaning, thinking her daughter had merely forgotten to throw out some food. Of course, she was curious about the source of the unpleasant odor and wanted to eliminate it. While sorting through dirty laundry, it quickly became apparent that the same unpleasant smell emanated from it. Digging to the bottom, she found a box containing a plastic bag. When she opened it, she found the lifeless body of a baby. Horrified, Teresa went to the police, reporting what had transpired. That same evening, law enforcement officers arrived at the Goodson house and took them to the station for questioning. Cassidy, without much resistance, admitted that there had been no miscarriage. She had simply given birth and hidden the baby's body from everyone. According to Cassidy's confession, on that fateful day, her water broke, but she managed to conceal it by soaking her bed linens. She then went to the bathroom, where she pretended to take a shower to disguise her actions. She bit down on a towel to endure the pain and stifle her cries while giving birth on the toilet, using scissors to remove the baby from herself. Once it was over, she used another towel to clean the bathroom of blood. Exhausted, she felt the baby breathing. Terrified of being exposed, she decided to get rid of him. Cassidy strangled her child, hid his body in a plastic bag, which she placed in a shoebox and concealed in her room. Remarkably, Cassidy managed to perform all these actions quickly and without being noticed by the rest of her family, who were at home at the time. The detective wanted to classify the crime properly, so they were interested in the details. Initially, Cassidy was uncooperative but eventually agreed to tell them everything, reconstructing the events on camera. She was given a doll resembling Santa Claus and demonstrated her actions, indicating what she had done. After the baby was in her arms, he did not open his eyes, leading her to realize with horror that she had grabbed the newborn by the throat and squeezed it with all her might. She believed the baby would not survive. The murder occurred while the child was still connected to her by the umbilical cord. Afterward, she cut it, washed everything, and wrapped the baby's body in a plastic bag before hiding it in the laundry container. Cassidy had not discarded the box with the body simply because she did not know how to dispose of it correctly. Only an autopsy could confirm or refute her words. The forensic expert determined that the baby had been born healthy and full term, weighing 9.5 pounds. So, the claim that the baby was born prematurely was impossible to uphold. The baby could have survived if not for the barbaric actions of his mother. The autopsy confirmed that the child died due to suffocation. Additionally, he had multiple injuries, including a head injury from blunt force trauma, likely from a fall after birth. However, this injury could not have been fatal. The most alarming injuries were the lacerations on the small body inflicted by the scissors, which had been used as a surgical instrument to extract the child from her. The detectives were puzzled as to why she left the baby's body in her room, as it seemed Cassidy did not even intend to dispose of it. The unbearable smell in the room ultimately exposed her. Psychologists suggested that this could be a form of remorse. Perhaps Cassidy wanted to be caught to receive what she believed was deserved punishment. Interestingly, Cassidy continued to remain silent about the identity of the baby's father. Detectives speculated whether her pregnancy could have resulted from another crime, such as violence against a minor. But Cassidy only stated that she was trying to hide the pregnancy from her family out of fear that it would harm her relationships with her parents, whom she did not want to disappoint. She intended to give birth and get rid of the baby from the beginning, indicating that her actions were premeditated. After these revelations, Cassidy was arrested and taken to a correctional facility for juvenile offenders in the county. After assessing the nature of the crime, she was charged with premeditated murder. In addition, the question arose about bringing charges of child abuse under aggravating circumstances, also of the first degree. The police believed that her horrific act was enough to try the offender as an adult in order to seek a harsher sentence. They knew her as a smart girl who was never prone to violence. Her parents insisted she was simply too immature to properly evaluate her horrific actions. Under the Florida criminal justice system for adults, the maximum penalty for first-degree murder is life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. However, due to Cassidy's age, she could not be sentenced to death. Additionally, earlier that same year, a ruling was issued by the U.S. Supreme Court declaring mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for juvenile prisoners unconstitutional. Cassidy's lawyer faced a difficult fight, not only with the system but also with outraged local residents who learned all the details of the crime and demanded the harshest punishment. Cassidy's parents found a good lawyer who managed to negotiate a plea bargain for manslaughter. The hearings were very emotional. The Goodson family supported Cassidy, and everyone cried, realizing that this murder could ruin many lives. Teresa was brought in for questioning before the trial began. Teresa denied knowing about the pregnancy and detailed how she had initially suspected her daughter was pregnant, but had taken her word for it after the pregnancy tests. She believed that her daughter was simply gaining weight, which could easily be explained by hormonal changes during adolescence. She insisted that if she had known about her daughter's delicate situation, she would have never allowed what happened. She would have supported her daughter and helped Cassidy with childbirth. Later, none of Cassidy's relatives were held accountable. In a video shown to the jury, Cassidy has been reproduced how she killed her newborn son. She repeated that as soon as he was born, she hoped that he was not breathing, but after touching him, she realized that this was not the case, he was alive and breathing. Cassidy then squeezed the baby's neck with her hands, simply to make him stop breathing so that she would not have any problems. It took her about a minute to kill the boy. At the sentencing, the judge emphasized that Cassidy had never previously encountered problems with the law and that the probability of her posing a threat to society was considered minimal. In his opinion, Cassidy was simply immature for such a responsible step as motherhood. However, she was old enough to be punished for her cruel act. During the sentencing, the judge expressed hope that she would not be in the dock for another crime. The prosecutor and the lawyer agreed that Cassidy deserved a second chance, and it was decided to send her to a special program at the Hillsborough Academy for Girls. As she left the courtroom, Cassidy wiped away tears with the sleeve of her prison uniform. A few months later, Cassidy had to appear in court again for the commission to decide her future. She was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison, with the stipulation that if she again went down a slippery path of crime, she would not receive another chance for rehabilitation. After her release, she would be under close supervision and must follow the rules. Upon the slightest violation, Cassidy could end up behind bars again, as an adult. Special attention was paid to the investigation of the child's paternity. detectives were able to establish that it was another minor who did not even know about the pregnancy. The relationship between Cassidy and the boy had ended before the pregnancy. The specific name of the young man was never revealed, so that no one else would be implicated in this high-profile case, which had caused wide public resonance and uproar. Protracted disputes and debates were just beginning, as this case raised the whole country on its feet. All local and national media seemed to want to comment on the incident. In particular, one of the studies detailed numerous incidents similar to the Cassidy-Goodson case, identifying a common pattern: girls are most afraid of hiding their pregnancies from their mothers. It is noteworthy that many of these crimes are committed by unmarried girls who fear being judged by their parents. However, not everyone agreed with this theory. Some studies conducted by other experts indicated that fathers tend to be stricter in such matters. In any case, this raised the sensitive issue of the Goodson family's involvement and the contribution they made to the boy's death. Cassidy maintained she was compelled to hide her situation from her relatives, fearing relationship deterioration. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, she continued to insist on her version of events and openly lied. For many, this issue was particularly acute, especially after the events that unfolded. Experts in psychiatry had split into two camps. Some supported Cassidy and considered her family indirectly involved, while others solely blamed her for the crime. All of this sparked numerous debates, with research results being scrutinized and analyzed. For example, another expert study showed that 7 out of 9 girls who committed such crimes were their father's favorites or had grown up without a mother. Despite their lack of mental health issues in everyday life, they portrayed simplified roles that created a dangerous mix. This mix led to significant adjustments in their behavior and ultimately resulted in the murder of newborns. At the same time, these girls were often successful in their studies, participated in sports, and were popular in school, similar to Cassidy. This mix of roles caused a kind of guilt for being close to someone, which could distort their perception, making their own baby seem alien or harmful, something to be gotten rid of. Often, such teenagers hope of stillbirth, as it appears to be the easiest way to avoid responsibility. After that, they can dispose of the child without guilt and leave. All of this can be exacerbated by isolation from loved ones, as was observed in Cassidy's case. Refusing to discuss her problems with her family, she drove herself into a corner. Cassidy's actions sparked controversy, including debates about the topic of terminating pregnancies. It seemed that this would be an obvious solution to her problem. However, judging from the social media reactions and media coverage of the Cassidy-Goodson story was used as an argument in favor of allowing abortions at such a young age. Many wondered why the burden of making such heavy decisions was entirely placed on an underage schoolgirl. Cassidy's parents' attempts to understand what was happening, they remained convinced that they had done absolutely nothing wrong. Questions arose about how one could not notice their daughter's growing belly and strange behavior. Why did they so easily and simplistically ignore the growth of her belly? Relatives noted that her behavior became increasingly uncharacteristic for her. Usually, close relatives notice such changes, but in her case, it seemed as if everyone was indifferent to her fate. They were surprised that it took finding blood in the bathroom for her mother to understand what was happening. Why, before this event, did no one take Cassidy to a medical center? Some people attempted to shift the blame for the crime from Cassidy to her parents, believing that she simply did not receive enough attention from her loved ones. This, too, could have concealed the real reason for her desire to keep the pregnancy secret. People were divided on these issues, with many disturbed by the fact that scissors were used. According to doctors, Cassidy used them to cut herself, severing the umbilical cord of a still, living child. To quickly pull out the baby, she used an ordinary office tool as a surgical instrument. Naturally, Cassidy experienced severe pain, but to cope with it, she clenched a piece of towel in her teeth. It was unclear what led to this mental or emotional state, whether it was her own horror or fear of what her parents might do. She was terrified of enduring any punishment just to prevent her mother and father from discovering what was happening. This raised reasonable concerns about what was really occurring within the walls of her home, leading detectives to conduct a thorough investigation. However, suspicions of cruel treatment from the parents' side could not be confirmed, as no bruises or signs of abuse were found on Cassidy's body. The other children in the family denied any physical abuse from their mother and father. After a year and a half in a correctional facility for girls, Cassidy was released. She successfully completed a rehabilitation program for juvenile offenders, and it was noted that she was not aggressive. The risk of reoffending was considered minimal. Cassidy desperately resisted reintegrating into society, having lost all her friends, received threats, and feared going outside. She often admitted that she felt hated and even persecuted. Cassidy realized she was living in hell, and it was unclear when this would end. She returned to her bedroom, which her parents had left untouched since her arrest. Everything remained in its usual place, even the lotion she had used at the age of 14. The hardest part was looking into the eyes of her loved ones, who wanted to help her. Despite the traumatic events and the heinous act she committed, Cassidy did not abandon her desire to become a mother. In 2017, she married and gave birth to her first daughter, followed by her second daughter, 2 years later. After the birth of her second girl, she posted on her social media that she longed to have a boy. These events were not just happy moments in her life but also demonstrated Cassidy's determination to fight. She expressed online that people around her seemed to wish she wouldn't have children at all. When asked why, Cassidy responded with a smile, indicating that people could not forgive her for killing a baby and that she had many haters. Many wrote that they wanted Cassidy to remain behind bars for the rest of her life, unwilling to live next to a child killer. On her social media, Cassidy posted numerous photos portraying herself as a loving mother, a young woman trying to build her happiness and family. It seemed that with age, as she began to understand the full gravity of her crime, she struggled to forgive herself for the fact that her first child died. In fact, the boy did not even have a name. Cassidy didn't consider what to call him. Therefore, in the case of the murder of a newborn, he was simply referred to as Baby Goodson. All these years, Cassidy remained under close scrutiny from not only the authorities but also the public. Even after so long, people remained indignant about the fate of the boy strangled in the first minutes of life. In her posts, Cassidy often hinted at external pressure. In 2020, she made a post indicating that she was being subjected to constant harassment that she could no longer tolerate. Cassidy created a new account and began sharing her photos again. She studied to be a nurse at Madison College. It appears that the judge may have been mistaken in thinking that she had corrected her ways. Since 2021, she began to face legal troubles again and ended up in prison, just like her husband. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Shirley and Duguay. Choosing a soulmate is a very important step because this person can become the love of your life or a real nightmare. Shirley and Duguay was born on October 11, 1962. She was a native of Prince Edward Island, born and raised in the smallest of the Canadian provinces. Regarding her early years, she grew up in a close, knit family with 2 sisters. They had a loving father who supported them and was family-oriented, a value he passed on to his daughters. By 1994, Shirley was a 32-year-old mother of 5 children, 2 of whom were from previous relationships. However, she was going through a serious crisis with her husband, Douglas Beamish, with whom she had been in a relationship for several years. Shirley worked hard and devoted the rest of her time to her children. This was very helpful to her. She never lost faith in herself or people and maintained a positive attitude, constantly communicating with relatives and friends who supported her in every possible way. She truly needed that support as she barely managed to finalize her divorce proceedings with Doug. A dispute over custody of the children arose during their relationship, which had become increasingly oppressive. Shirley repeatedly complained that she was a victim of domestic violence. People in her close circle often saw traces of beatings on her. Despite the cruelty of the relationship, she rejected any proposals to separate, believing that her husband would simply kill her if she tried to leave. Even when Shirley reached a boiling point, her husband managed to keep her from getting a divorce. She was financially dependent on him, emotionally depressed, and simply afraid she would not be able to cope with the children without his support. Unfortunately, as they aged, his aggression began to shift toward the younger generation. At this point, Shirley sought support from the state to combat domestic violence. The Canadian justice system treated problems within the family with much less attention than the situation required. Despite numerous threats, statements, and evidence of aggression, Shirley failed to achieve any prohibitions or restrictions against Douglas. Finally gathering her strength, Shirley filed for divorce and moved out with the children. Now, the most pressing issue was the division of custody rights. During this period, she had 5 children aged 8 to 15. She feared for their health and safety given her husband's behavior. As a result, she sought sole custody of her 3 youngest children, fearing that Douglas would take revenge and shift his anger onto them. She intended to limit his opportunities for supervised visitations to no more than once a week. Additionally, she was counting on alimony because raising 5 children alone would be too challenging. Though she was already receiving small payments for 2 children from a previous relationship, it was not enough. Shirley's intentions only fueled Doug's anger. By the fall of 1994, she repeatedly expressed fears for her life. Yet, despite everything, she continued to hope for the best and led a normal life. On October 7, 1994, a woman found an abandoned car on Highway 169, near Tyne Valley in rural Prince Edward Island. She couldn't specify how long it had been there since she had been away from home for several days. Upon her return, she immediately noticed a car parked oddly in the middle of a field. When she approached to offer help to the driver, her worry grew. The car had no license plates, and on the windshield, there were numerous small splashes resembling blood. There was no one near the car, so she quickly contacted the police. Upon receipt of report, the law enforcement officers arrived at the scene and confirmed that something terrible had possibly happened in the car. Inside, they found many bloodstains but no signs of a struggle or dragging nearby, suggesting it had been abandoned far from where a confrontation had taken place. Investigators wondered if the victim of such an attack could have survived. Due to the lack of license plates, identifying the car took longer. Eventually, detectives discovered it belonged to 32-year-old Shirley and Duguay. They tried to contact her, but to no avail, as her address was not known. They could only find her father and children. As it turned out, none of her relatives or friends had heard anything about her despite several police calls. Shirley had stopped responding to calls 4 days before the witness reported the abandoned car, approximately on October 3rd. It was normal for her to leave periodically for work, so during that entire time, no one suspected anything was wrong. No one could find the mother of the children, leading the police to begin a search operation, considering Shirley might be in danger. Given the amount of blood in the cabin, it was evident that the attack had been committed with great cruelty. This was also indicated by the nature of the splashes, which were analyzed by experts. Blood doesn't randomly splatter all over a cabin from random blows, it suggested a prolonged beating. Such behavior was atypical for either robbery or abuse, as typically, brutal criminals are well acquainted with their victims. Naturally, the immediate environment of Shirley was inspected, and everyone who knew Shirley pointed to her ex-husband, Doug. There were no other suspects, only he had issues with her. This man constantly beat her and threatened her. Investigators decided to interview Doug. He confirmed that he had a tense relationship with his wife but blamed her difficult character. He denied any accusations of domestic violence and cruelty on his part, accusing his wife of wanting to spite him after the divorce. Given the capabilities of forensic science in 1994, it was not possible to quickly determine the source of the blood found in the car. Doug behaved calmly, and there was no evidence linking him to the crime. Despite numerous witnesses believing him guilty, this was deemed insufficient. The main problem was the absence of a body. It remained unclear what happened to Shirley, so she was still considered missing. Days, weeks, and months passed. It became obvious to everyone that she was likely not alive, but the only suspect persisted. Authorities combed a vast area with a radius of tens of kilometers around where they found the abandoned car. The squad did manage to find valuable evidence, but no direct indications of Doug's involvement. Detectives interrogated him repeatedly again, but to no avail. When they compared the blood found in the car with samples from Shirley's relatives, they confirmed that the profiles matched, which meant the victim of the beating in the car, as expected, was Shirley. Interestingly, in addition to Shirley's blood, traces belonging to someone else were found inside the car. Analysis compared to Doug's blood showed that the additional blood belonged to him. However, without a body, even this evidence did not establish a direct link to the crime or elicit a confession from him. He insisted that the car was his, as Shirley had used it during their 15-year relationship, and he could have repeatedly injured himself inside it. It was impossible to calculate the exact time of his bloodstain's appearance. All of this caused bewilderment and discontent among the relatives of Shirley. The local community was also outraged because a dangerous person was walking free. Many believed in Doug's guilt. The Duguay family insisted that he was the only one capable of such cruelty. In the car, there were numerous splatters of blood, and experts indicated they resulted from medium force blows. However, the police were not sure if the criminal had used a weapon. The cushion on Shirley's seat was soaked in blood. She had used it to sit while driving. Being a petite woman, about 150 centimeters tall and weighing around 45 kilograms, she needed the cushion to control the vehicle effectively. The cushion had blood from two different sources mixed. About 1 kilometer from the abandoned car, they discovered a shovel with traces of blood and 2 black hairs. This evidence became the first valuable clue examined by forensic scientists in the laboratory. Microscopic analysis and comparison with the hairs found on Shirley confirmed they belonged to her. By this time, the search operation had been underway for more than a month. The most significant find was a thick plastic bag containing a pair of sports shoes and a leather jacket, both covered in blood. The items were located 2.5 kilometers from Shirley's car. The blood stain analysis confirmed they belonged to Shirley. However, the shoes and jacket were clearly not her size, were more consistent with a man's. When questioned about the sneakers and jacket, Douglas denied ever having worn anything like that. Unfortunately, there was once again no confirmation of this, as his blood was not found on the jacket or shoes. Detectives noticed that the sizes matched, but this was not enough to bring charges. The list of evidence included significant circumstantial evidence. It turned out to be a tough nut to crack, so more information was needed. The found shoes were sent to shoe expert Key Beadle. He knew well that each person wears shoes in their own way. Differences in shape, size, and structure of feet result in unique features in mechanics. Each person's gait is as unique as their fingerprints. If the shoes had been worn for a long time, this would affect the geometry and wear characteristics. Dr. Key began studying the marks left on the insole and the inner surface of the sole. As part of the investigation, a warrant was obtained to create casts of Douglas's feet. This became an important stage in the process. In parallel, the expert analyzed the condition of the insoles and soles of the discovered shoes, revealing that the criminal had a deformed big toe. A small, twisted print suggested that Doug had used them. Nevertheless, Doug continued to deny his involvement. Forensic experts placed great hopes on analyzing the jacket, which had peculiar fibers, including 20 thin white hairs. With this exception, no other evidence remained on the clothing. The forensic experts examined the fibers under a microscope and found that they resembled animal hair rather than human hair. The detectives were busy with the investigation, and one of them recalled an important detail. When he first came to speak with Doug at his home, he saw a white cat named Snowball. By connecting the owner of the jacket to the animal, they could potentially establish who owned the item of clothing. The police became convinced that these lint particles were left by the criminal's cat, which led to the key question of how to prove the criminal's guilt through his pet. The search began for an expert who dealt with such matters. Detectives made hundreds of phone calls and were amazed to find that such studies had not yet been explored in the history of criminology and forensic science. The closest researchers were pet experts studying their genes to combat diseases. Dr. Stephen O'Brien, a geneticist from the National Institute in the USA, spent decades studying hereditary diseases in cats, including cancer. He knew more about pet genetics than anyone else in the world. However, even he did not promise much. Comparing the DNA profile of Snowball with detected fibers was a unique task. First, it was necessary to obtain a blood sample from the cat, but the owner of the pet was not inclined to cooperate with the police. A significant amount of time was spent just catching the cat on the street and getting a blood sample. Finally, Dr. O'Brien received samples of Snowball's materials, including fur, which were transported almost under escort. Fortunately, many of these hair follicles were preserved, providing enough for a DNA profile comparison. Dr. O'Brien confirmed that the fibers belonged to the same animal. However, a new question arose. Prince Edward Island was nearly isolated, and the doctor had serious suspicions that many domestic cats lived there, which could mean they were all related. If this was indeed the case, then comparing DNA profiles could show a match with any two animals in the province, calling into question all the work done. The police were not planning to give up, so they decided to gather at least 24 blood samples from cats in the area, which would later be delivered to Dr. O'Brien's laboratory for analysis and comparison. This process took even more time, during which the dangerous criminal was still at large. When the report was finally ready, Dr. O'Brien confirmed that there was great genetic diversity among the cats on Prince Edward Island. Not a single pair of the 20 samples collected matched. This led to the conclusion that, apart from Snowball, only one of the 70 million cats could have owned this fur, which became a turning point that confirmed the white fur of the jacket belonged to Douglas's cat. Despite this evidence, Douglas continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the jacket and claimed he had no idea where his ex-wife was. More than 6 months passed, but the body of Shirley was still not found. 7 months after the disappearance of Shirley, a random fisherman was sailing along the river in Enmore. He noticed something suspicious in the bushes along the shore but could not see it clearly. So, he decided to swim closer. From a distance of several meters, he realized that the remains definitely belonged to a person, but the stature was so small that the fisherman initially thought it was a child. They was far from the city, so he thought that wild animals might have dragged someone's body away. He covered the remains with his raincoat and went towards the city to contact the police. When the authorities finally arrived, they saw the remains of a woman in a state of severe decomposition. The situation was not as dire as it could have been because the remains had not been exposed to extreme heat, which partially alleviated the decomposition situation. The examination confirmed that the body belonged to Shirley and Duguay. Although it was buried, the body surfaced due to abnormal weather conditions that made the coastal soil unstable, causing it to wash away. Despite the degree of decomposition, it was obvious that Shirley had been subjected to cruelty. The exact cause of death could not be established. There were several theories. One suggested that she had been strangled, while another proposed that she was beaten with a shovel, as the shovel was found earlier. However, it could not be ruled out that the blood stain on the shovel was made after Shirley's death. The killer might have accidentally caused damage when digging up the makeshift grave. Shirley's jaw had been beaten and was broken in 3 places, with one of her missing teeth found in her lungs. The situation had changed dramatically, and it remained to be understood what the motive was, making it possible to hold Douglas accountable. After the body was discovered, investigators decided to take a fresh look at the old evidence and re-examine the area around Shirley's house and car. This yielded important results. First of all, they discovered a letter that had been overlooked earlier, contained threats. Thanks to this letter, the motive for the murder was revealed. It turned out that immediately after Shirley filed for sole custody rights, Douglas wrote her a frightening note in which he said he would be happier to see her in the grave than to lose the children forever. This could have been a cruel joke if not for the alarming fact that this letter was written in her ex-husband's blood. Unfortunately, Shirley did not have time to disclose this, publicize it, or show it to the police, as the criminal carried out his sentence earlier. Additionally, in the house of Shirley, they found photographs showing Shirley and Douglas together. He in the image wore the very jacket from which the hairs of his cat were later found. Finally, a little more than a month after the murder, Douglas was arrested and placed under custody until the hearing began. On July 19, 1996, Douglas Beamish ended up in court, largely thanks to his cat, Snowball, who who was instrumental in the pursuit of justice. Douglas was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. This case became the first in crime history where DNA and animal materials were used as evidence of a criminal's guilt. According to Dr. O'Brien, the day he began examining and comparing those white hairs marked the birth of veterinary forensic examination. In the following years, this practice was utilized many times and led to the imprisonment of several dangerous criminals. The center at the University of California, Davis, has used its methods in more than 500 cases over the past 15 years, confirming that the tools used to profile human DNA also work reliably on animals. Shirley's daughter, Shelley, grew up to become an advocate for abused women. She spoke about how, as a child, she watched her mother being beaten by her father. After his conviction, Douglas ended up in the Ontario Correctional Centre. In 1998 and 1999, he tried to appeal his conviction but was denied, as DNA evidence is considered irrefutable. In 2013, he first attempted to exercise his right to parole. However, he was again refused, as the commission ruled that the risk of committing another crime was too high. This was not the end of Douglas's story. After almost 25 years behind bars, discussions began about releasing the killer from prison under escort for 12 hours. Another meeting of the parole commission was held, during which relatives were present. Shirley's sister, Marie Arsenault, spoke out, stating that the murder of her sister had triggered a series of family tragedies. One sister became addicted to alcohol as a means of coping with the pain of loss. It spiraled out of control after Shirley's death. She died first due to health problems, and then her husband committed to end his own life because he could not cope with the death of his beloved wife, having tried to save her until the last moment. She insisted that if Douglas was released, he should be prohibited from living on Prince Edward Island. Shirley's father suffered a series of heart attacks after Marie spoke at the parole board meeting. Interestingly, during these hearings, Douglas took responsibility for Shirley's death for the first time. Prior to this, he had persistently denied his guilt. The commission determined that he still posed a high risk of reoffending, including crimes related to violence and cruelty. Despite finally admitting guilt and realizing the seriousness of his actions, it was believed that significant work still needed to be done before he was ready for full parole. Until that point, he had found it easier to blame others for what had happened than to face the truth. During his time in prison, Douglas suffered 3 heart attacks and kidney failure, nearly dying several times. He is currently serving his sentence in Dorchester Prison, having been transferred there a year before the hearing, during which he was granted a 12-hour escorted release. He expressed a desire to attend a rehabilitation center for ex-offenders convicted of serious crimes located in the Moncton area. Notably, the parole board noted 2 incidents demonstrating that he was not yet ready for life on the outside. In 2019, he threw a knife while preparing food in the kitchen of a minimum security correctional facility, and a year later, he went on a hunger strike, claiming dissatisfaction with the food provided by prison staff. Following the end of the meeting, a decision regarding Douglas Beamish's 12-hour temporary release was not established. He himself stated that he believed he was not ready for full release but wanted to visit a rehabilitation center in Moncton as he did not want to return to Prince Edward Island. It is worth noting that the Correctional Service of Canada had previously allowed him to be temporarily absent under escort for medical reasons and out of compassion. Both occasions took place without incident. Jessica Edens was born on January 22, 1981, in a small suburb of New York State, USA. She came from a large family, with a sister named Diane and 2 half-brothers, Nathan and Adam. Jessica spent her early years surrounded by loving parents and siblings, with whom she developed warm relationships. She didn't have outstanding academic success but was always creative, dreaming of becoming a photographer. When her parents recognized this passion, they bought her an amateur camera, which she carried everywhere. She took pictures of people, nature, cities, and architecture, anything that caught her attention. Her work was admired and praised. During her teenage years, Jessica actively pursued this passion and mastered the craft. She began to shoot weddings and various events, initially for free, then for a small fee. This allowed her to earn enough money for her own needs, and the idea of building a real business became increasingly appealing. Jessica's personal life was also progressing. She was sociable, active, attractive, and always attracted a lot of attention. On November 19, 2007, she gave birth to a son named Hayden King. Jessica became pregnant during a rapidly developing relationship with a young man, but the love between them faded quickly, and they broke up before Hayden was born. However, Jessica remained optimistic and maintained friendly relations with the child's biological father, allowing him to communicate with Hayden. Jessica was determined to provide everything her child needed, regardless of whether she had a partner or was raising him as a single mother. Fortunately, she did not have to be alone for long. In 2008, Jessica met a man named Benjamin Edens. They quickly found common ground, grew closer, and within a few meetings, they could not imagine their lives without each other. They was in no hurry to officially register their marriage, as both were creative individuals who understood each other well. After a few months, they moved in together, and Jessica began to contemplate having more children. After a while, they officially got married in 2010. Shortly thereafter, they decided to move to a new large house located in a small, cozy town in Easley, South Carolina, which was ideal for a quiet family life. Their family relationships flourished, and Jessica was convinced she had found the man of her dreams, a feeling that was mutual. 2 years later, on July 19, 2012, they welcomed a daughter named Harper Edens. Jessica believes this further strengthens her relationship with Benjamin. He was a wonderful father who spent all his free time with Harper. He also became so close to Hayden that the boy did not suspect Benjamin was not his biological father. By 2017, Hayden was in the 4th grade, while his younger sister Harper was about to start 1st grade in the fall. This was an exciting milestone. From the outside, Jessica's family appeared perfect. She had 2 children, a beloved job, and a husband whom she described to everyone as the best person. Her eldest child was a good student, and the family expected the same from Harper. Jessica's passion for photography thrived, but when she had her daughter, she decided to take a break and become a housewife, stepping back from her small but successful photo business. However, as Harper grew more independent, Jessica returned to attending various events to conduct professional photography. To simplify her client search, she created a website where she introduced herself as a photographer from Greenville. Jessica described her life as perfect, but, as often happens, things were exaggerated. Behind the facade of love and understanding, difficulties began to arise in the marriage. Over time, Benjamin's feelings cooled, and tension accumulated between them. Jessica wanted to understand what was happening as she began to notice uncharacteristic behaviors in her husband. He would come home from work, immediately run into the shower without even saying hello to his wife and children, as if he were trying to hide something. More and more often, he stayed at work much longer than his shift lasted, citing overtime and global projects that no one could confirm. He began to actively engage in sports, carefully monitored his appearance, and switched to healthy eating. All this could look like ordinary healthy habits that people develop with age, but not with Jessica. She began to suspect Benjamin of cheating. Quickly, a suitable candidate for an affair appeared. A young, attractive woman had recently started at her husband's workplace. This woman's name was Meredith Rom. She was born on October 29, 1988, in Collierville, Tennessee. In Jessica's opinion, it was on Meredith that her husband had set his eyes. In the early years of Meredith's life, her parents divorced, and her mother quickly found a new man and remarried, so Meredith had a stepfather named Carlton Chambers. He was a worthy person and became like a second father to her. The family in which she grew up was friendly and loving. Meredith had a younger sister named Brittany Rowell. She dedicated herself to her studies from an early age and was focused on career success. She studied well and was creative, like Jessica, but family and children were of little interest to her. In 2009, she graduated from the University of Memphis with a bachelor's degree in international business. After gaining some necessary experience, she moved to Greenville. Meredith was very independent and self-confident, which immediately caught Benjamin's eye. By the time they met, Meredith had started working at the same company as Benjamin. In fact, Jessica's suspicions were justified. Immediately after meeting Meredith, her husband became attracted to her. Their feelings come from both sides. They started dating in secret, and their affair continued for a year. Now, Benjamin finally realized that he wanted to be with his young mistress and wanted to break up with Jessica, but he didn't know how to approach the issue. He was afraid of offending his wife and wanted to avoid the difficulties of the divorce process. For a long time, Benjamin was torn between his family and his mistress. His wife's suspicions only aggravated the situation. The more accusations she made, the more inevitable the breakup felt, which provoked constant quarrels. Jessica did not trust her husband and wanted to find out what was going on. He tried to distance himself, but this could not go on forever. It was time to tell the truth, but Benjamin could not bring himself to do it. Instead of confessing, he decided to move out on far-fetched grounds, citing constant pressure from his wife. On April 11, 2017, Benjamin packed his things and moved from the shared family home to a rented apartment. At least that is what he initially told his wife. Jessica kept hoping that these were only temporary difficulties that many people experience, and that their marriage would be saved. She believed she could convince her husband to return to her and their children. Benjamin tried to avoid the topic of separation altogether, reluctantly answered calls and messages, which only offended her more. The betrayal was of such a magnitude that she could not forgive it. She was angry, and her hopes for a family reunion were shattered. But most of all, she was furious that Benjamin simply ignored her. As the persecution began, Jessica spread various damaging facts about Meredith on all social networks and on any sites where she could post information, exposing her as the homewrecker and her husband as a cheater. Jessica continued to communicate regularly with Benjamin, trying to win him back. Instead, he finally decided to file for divorce. Telling Jessica this provoked even more anger from her, and she now decided to annoy him as much as possible. She knew how much Benjamin loved their daughter Harper, so she sought sole custody of the girl. He had always been a caring father and loved the children, including Hayden. Therefore, he was against such a decision. Benjamin wanted to maintain the right to communicate with the children. He did not want to sit idly by. He hoped to smooth over the conflict and therefore proposed joint custody. Jessica was adamant. Against this backdrop, a serious custody battle began, and tensions escalated. Realizing that it would not be possible to agree amicably, Benjamin went to court on July 11th. He wanted to gain an advantage and testified under oath that Jessica was using the children as a weapon of revenge. By this point, Jessica had completely prevented meetings and communication between the children with their father, not even allowing contact through social networks and mobile phones. Everything was under her total control. Benjamin was afraid she could go too far. Simultaneously, Jessica intensified her harassment of Benjamin and Meredith. She continued to post not just hateful words toward Meredith on social media but also used graphic photos and other offensive captions. Previously, Jessica had tried to portray Benjamin's mistress as a family destroyer. Now, even more disturbing captions began to appear. She claimed that Meredith would get what she deserved, though she never specified what she meant. Meredith, the target of the harassment, began to fear that all of this could be dangerous. However, Benjamin insisted that Jessica had no history of violence, so he believed the situation would gradually settle down. He tried not to provoke her further, but it had little effect. The situation only worsened. When Jessica learned about the filing of a joint custody application by her husband, she was furious. Benjamin had always been a decent person, a valuable employee who earned a good salary and had no bad habits or addictions, so there were no serious grounds for denying him custody or terminating his contact with the children. He simply wanted to see them. Now that he had received the right to visit, which Jessica could not oppose. Due to the impossibility of taking revenge, she began to come up with more sophisticated ways to annoy him. Every short communication with Benjamin ended in conflicts and accusations. It was even more annoying to her that the mistress would be in contact with the children. During this period, Benjamin and Meredith regularly contacted the police to complain about Jessica's behavior. In particular, Meredith could no longer tolerate the publications that Jessica made about her daily on various social networks. She starts having problems at work when Jessica tries to turn things around her. Benjamin tried to prove that Jessica's behavior was stalking and very disturbing. Worse, he began receiving frightening messages from Jessica, all concerning the children. It seemed she was trying to intimidate him with ambiguous phrases, and he worried that his daughter might be in danger. In July 2017, after a court meeting, he called the police to check on the welfare of the children at Jessica's house. He described the situation in detail. He felt powerless since Jessica still interfered with the meetings, and he did not want to use force, fearing she would use this in court against him to strip him of his joint custody rights. The officers who responded reported that everything was fine, but the anxiety from the threats continued to grow. On July 12, they discussed joint custody again. All attempts by Jessica to prevent this were unsuccessful, making her even more furious. During the day, Benjamin begins to receive more disturbing messages from his ex-wife. It was obvious to her that there was no legal way to limit the children's communication with their father, so she tried to irritate him further with her frightening messages. Benjamin contacted the police again and asked the patrol officers to go to the family home to check on the children's well-being. When the officers arrived, they again did not see anything suspicious. The report compiled by the patrolman stated that everything was fine, the family seemed normal, Jessica behaved calmly, and her son and daughter were in a good mood while watching a movie when the officers arrived. At that moment, Jessica insisted that Harper call Benjamin, realizing that he had called the police. All of this became part of her insidious plan to expose him as a liar. While the officer was in the house, he discussed the potential resumption of relations with Benjamin. Jessica denied wanting to reconcile, calling him a traitor who had cheated for a whole year. She couldn't forgive him and intended to use this in court to achieve sole custody of their daughter. She didn't want him in the children's lives. While the officer was filling out the report, Jessica began insisting that Benjamin and Meredith were very dangerous people, especially to the children. She claimed to have suffered from their behavior since the divorce process began and insisted that they were trying to portray her in a bad light. Jessica wanted to obtain a restraining order against them. The patrolman informed Jessica that, in order to get a restraining order, she would have to go through the court process after filing a report. After saying goodbye to the officers, she promised to file a statement in person soon, but that was not destined to happen. The next day, while Jessica's family was out of town, she went to her parents' house early in the morning and took a .40 caliber pistol that they used for self-defense. When relatives heard about this, Jessica warned her father about the need for a weapon, and he was not against it. They did not suspect the scale of the persecution that Jessica had arranged. She skillfully lied, making Benjamin look worse and referring to the persecution from him, that the danger emanating from her ex. Jessica claimed that she could not feel calm at home, she was simply afraid to be left alone with her 2 children. They were easily convinced that Benjamin and Meredith posed a threat, including to the children, and that the weapon would help protect them from what she described as extremely harmful communication. All of this sounded plausible, therefore, her parents had no problem with her needing the weapon for a while. Jessica planned to keep the gun in the house while the divorce process was ongoing. Jessica then sent text messages filled with accusations, now targeting everyone who knew Meredith. She managed to find information about the family and friends of Meredith, copying the messages to everyone, then telling them how Meredith had stolen her husband, destroyed her family, and was now trying to take the children. Jessica obtained the phone numbers of at least 5 friends of family members on social media. It seemed she was immersed in this all day, displaying behavior that resembled madness. She even personally called several people, relaying her story over her mobile phone. Some of Jessica's acquaintances became disappointed in her decency, causing real damage to her reputation. Benjamin also received even more terrifying messages. Jessica openly accused and intimidated him, stating that he would not receive anything, he would not gain access to Meredith and the children. Jessica wrote that because of his actions, he would have no chance of getting any of it, as she would not allow him to enjoy life after what he had done. Benjamin was extremely worried about this information and began to send Jessica message after message, trying to understand what she meant. However, she simply ignored all his questions, which only increased Benjamin's anxiety. He expressed his willingness to go to court for an emergency hearing regarding joint custody of the children, even threatened to try to take the children from her if she did not calm down. Finally, Jessica responded with a short message, "Your life will soon be better." Benjamin was sure that she was just mocking him and enjoying this situation. Jessica claimed that it was the last day she would experience pain, after which she ignored any attempts by Benjamin to contact her. On the morning of July 13, 2017, Jessica wrote to Benjamin again. She offered to meet so that Benjamin could answer some questions. However, Benjamin found everything very suspicious and hesitated to attend the meeting. He didn't suspect that this could turn out to be a fatal mistake. Benjamin tried to get her to talk on the phone to understand what she needed and why they couldn't discuss it without a meeting, but this only made Jessica even angrier. At 4:41 p.m., he received another message in which Jessica complained that she was tired of this bullying that never meant anything to Benjamin. In reality, old accusations and the most frightening threats she had ever voiced since the breakup emerged. Jessica's behavior was so alarming that Benjamin contacted her mother to discuss the situation, suspecting that Jessica was having a breakdown. He feared she could not control herself, might pose a danger to herself and the children. At that time, he was at work and could not leave. He did not suspect that while he was talking to Jessica's mother, Jessica was already driving to his apartment with bad intentions. At about 5 p.m., Jessica parked her car near the complex where Benjamin and Meredith lived. In the parking lot, Jessica saw Meredith, who had just returned from work and was sitting in her car, distracted by the mail on her mobile phone. Jessica approached her, pointed a gun, and shot through the glass, instantly killing her rival, whom she considered the cause of all her troubles. All this happened in broad daylight. As people were returning from work, the noise attracted numerous witnesses. After the incident, people saw Jessica get into her car and drive away. Neighbors contacted the police, reporting this and clarifying one frightening detail. At that time, there were 2 children in the car with the shooter. Witnesses described the shooter, and the police understood who they were talking about. They assumed that Benjamin was in danger. Jessica had enough time to act, but she was not going to go to Benjamin's workplace. Instead, she devised something much more sophisticated and stayed one step ahead of law enforcement. While the authorities were still looking for her in the city and were awaiting Benjamin's arrival at work, Jessica called Benjamin, told him that everyone he loved had left and that she would be next. Then Jessica hung up. It was the last call she made. Police eventually traced the call and went to Easley, 7 miles from the Benjamin home, where they saw her Jeep. The doors of the car were locked from the inside, and the engine was still running. Inside, they found 3 bodies, 2 children and Jessica herself, who was 36 years old. Jessica had persistently called Benjamin in hopes of meeting with him, perhaps intending him to be her first victim. However, he seemed to sense danger and avoided contact as much as possible, often opting to respond via a message on a messaging app. When she received a refusal, she flared up in anger and attacked Meredith, after which Jessica returned home. Near her house, she called Benjamin again. After a meaningless conversation, Jessica first attacked her 5-year-old daughter, then her 9-year-old son, after which she turned the gun on herself. Jessica used the same gun that she had borrowed from her parents on July 11th. During the investigation, detectives found out that Benjamin had been trying to obtain a restraining order against Jessica. He had filed for joint custody on the same day and had communicated with the police officer who came to check on the children. Jessica left 4 suicide notes, 1 for her mother, 1 for her father, 1 for her son's father, and 1 for her husband. In these notes, she expressed her love for her family and her regret for the pain her actions would cause them. Jessica insisted that she could no longer live with these feelings and believed that her children would also suffer without her, so she decided to take not only her life but theirs as well. In the letter to her son's father, she expressed gratitude for giving her her first child and apologized for the pain she had caused. Considering the content of these notes, the police investigated suspicions of domestic violence against the children. Judging by what Jessica wrote, it was possible she had harmed them as a way of exacting revenge on her unfaithful husband. However, nothing like this could be confirmed. As for the last note left by Jessica to Benjamin, it contained several short phrases in which she wished that Benjamin would experience the pain from his cruel act for the rest of his life. The note also stated that he would not be able to hurt them anymore. Among all the individuals involved in this case, Benjamin was the only survivor. The note turned out to be prophetic. Even to this day, he continues to live with the pain of losing his loved ones.